starting to feel better. Not sleepy. I'm not feeling better. You're gonna be okay. He seemed to be doing a lot better.
You like
I like the content. I like the flow. I like the vibe.
Thanks, baby. Thanks, Just Angel. Let's all talk sexy talk.
I need an update on London.
We need to increase the volume of our voice just a hitch.
Yeah, who's the guy with the D in the middle? Who is that?
My number.
The guy in the middle with the D.
I think.
Is that Big D?
GLX is asking if people are developmentally disabled. Wow.
If your name is Evergreen, why do you have a big D? Shouldn't it be a big E?
You gotta keep them off balance.
Lemon, come back up here and show everybody how
Is
stupid
Evergreen
you are.
like the tree?
What's the color?
Oh, I know why Lemonade's not up here. It's just
Because she's so many.
so many chairs, so little time.
So many brown chairs, so little time. So much hamster stuff.
I gotta be honest. I'm sorry to interrupt you guys, but that was awful to be like Jamie just going off like a crazy person. I hated that experience. How about you guys?
But you see how chill it is now?
Yeah, it's good.
No.
We're having a good time.
It's amazing because you need a little bit of angel here.
We need some Just Angel in the building. German lady.
Yeah, it is okay because I can talk whatever the fuck I want because my channel can't be struck because you got struck already. Just Angel, right?
Just Angel with 8,000 degrees today. It's
Maria.
Yeah, hold on.
Sorry.
Yes, Am.
Or however.
Don't call me sweetie. I hate that. I was very verbally abused when they called me that, and I didn't like that. My kidnapper called me that. I really appreciate you not calling me that.
Yeah, don't be sweetie if you don't.
I think Big D has air conditioning or something in the background. There's a lot of windstorm.
That's Just Angel.
It's me because I have
Just Angel. All right.
Damn, you got 120 people here. Holy shit.
Answer my question. Quick question. Do you like German lady? Do you think she's nice?
I love German lady.
I love her too.
I'm just trying to.
I love her.
She is so awesome.
You don't like her?
She's my chicky baby. She's my chicky baby.
I would do her.
But Jackson said, Jackson said we both suck.
Hey, Evergreen. Evergreen, why did you ask me that question?
Feels bad. Actually, I heard you on a Republican Ashes show against Cosmic. It wasn't that good. I hate to say it. I like you better.
You know what? But to tell you the truth, I was never on Republican Ashes Live, so you're lying out of your pipe
I'm
right
talking
now.
about yes, I do.
Who are you talking to?
Guys in black in the chat.
Oh, he's so
okay. Better come correct. I was about to open up a can on you.
So,
Jackson, I thought you were over in a donkey farm somewhere blowing things.
Freud to task.
Wait, hold on a second. Did Evergreen say that was disrespectful?
And it's that lack of self-love
German lady?
that makes narcissists so vulnerable. Because
Oh, that I was disrespectful husband?
I've choose things I've
No,
done.
listen.
At the end of his life, it said that Hubbard commissioned the magnetized valve to build a machine based upon his Hubbard electrometer that would actually kill him. And he told Faust that he failed, that his mission sociopathic behavior. So there's this, I think there's another possible route to it that the self doesn't develop. Hubbard was brought up by Lafayette in Lafayette, Washington. And I think there are two routes. And you mentioned
they have that deep emptiness and that deep suffering, but they're in such a state of denial and so good at propping up this defensive structure of narcissism that they rarely experience it. Or when they do, just they get a hint of it, they will strike out at someone else as a way of like establishing dominance over someone else as a way of it, because that's another way you can gain narcissism is through dominance. Like I'm dominant over you. I'm better than you. I'm superior.
Yep.
And so
And have control. Yeah.
right. And so, but in my experience, both people are deeply, deeply suffering on the inside. Not that I'm excusing their behavior, not. I'm just saying that's why they resort to such strange and elaborate defenses, and they learn these defenses are an adult. And suddenly, they realize how to defend against that emptiness. Probably from the age of like 2 or 3 or 4, they had the beginnings of a narcissistic personality, a way of showing off, a way of being dominant, a way of distracting themselves. Anyway,
I think there are 2 routes. You mentioned the route of abuse, but in studying Hubbard, so many people have said, "Oh, he must have been abused as a child," and I have seen absolutely no evidence of that. And we were able to interview his aunt who lived in the house with him throughout his childhood. We've seen correspondence from his mother, and it seems to me that the other possible route is that the child is overvalued. That the expectation placed upon the child is too much. It interested me that in looking at Sun Myung Moon, the founder of the Moon is the Unification Church, as it calls itself, that he too was brought up in the household of a grandparent rather than his father being head of the household. His grandfather was. Hubbard was brought up by Lafayette in Lafayette Waterbury's household, and his father was absent most of the time. And he had this idea of his mother and his 4 doting aunts and his grandfather all having this incredible expectation of him that he was going to be this fantastic, wonderful man. And he really didn't, apart from having a natural cunning, he really didn't have a lot going for him. He was not a highly educated man. He was not capable of becoming highly educated. He was thrown out of university in the first year. But I think that expectation was always in the back of his mind. And he turned towards abusing others, it would appear, as a teenager. He started, again, if you look at Rajneesh, there's a story that when he was, I think, about 8 years old, he convinced one of his school friends to walk a tightrope, and the friend fell and died. And this risk-taking and forcing others to take risks is a normal part of sociopathic behavior. So there's this, I think there's another possible route to it that the self doesn't develop because the expectation is impossible. You're going to be a Buddha or a world leader or something like this, and you're told this from the moment you're born. It makes it impossible. I think also, I've recently read Escape from Freedom, written in 1941 by the great Erich Fromm. And he takes Freud to task and says, well, Freud says that selfish people only love themselves. But the truth is that selfish people don't love anyone. And it's that lack of self-love that makes the narcissist so vulnerable, because they can't sit down and go, well, I've achieved things, I've done things. At the end of his life, it said that Hubbard commissioned a man called Sarge Falk to build a machine based upon his Hubbard electrometer that would actually kill him. And he told Falk that he failed, that his mission on Earth, to humanity was a complete failure. And that vulnerability, that collapsing, is an aspect of the condition.
Right. The way that I've conceptualized people like Hubbard and
Oh my God, that's the best you got it. It's your
Randy's back. Okay, be quiet, Deanna. Everybody mute except
Quiet, Lemonade. Randy's up here. Be quiet. Have respect for her.
I don't know, Randy, what's up? I don't know, what's up with you? Hey. You had my name in your mouth.
Good point, Caleb.
I haven't talked about you at all, actually. No,
Randy, make her swallow it. She lets her swallow. Make her swallow it.
No, please, everybody mute. I haven't talked about you, actually. Actually, you have. No, when? Please inform me. No, that's okay. You can go back to your own videos. So, what? What? You think you're so important that I would have to make up the fact that you mentioned me?
I honestly, Randy,
Listen, the only reason I know who you are is because you humiliated yourself on RDA. Yeah, but here's the thing. What I want you to say to me right now, the things that you said to FOD.
What do I need to say to you right now? Please tell me.
Baby, don't make, you can't talk about anybody's voice. At least I use my real one.
That is a damn.
You are like the fakest drunk on YouTube, honey.
That's exactly
I wish, like, I truly wish.
I know you did. I know that you wish you were me. We know.
No, I actually
As I was saying,
right now.
say 2 minutes. I'm pretty sure you do my that anyway. What I'm saying is, say to me what you had the freaking nerve to say to FOD when you just tell all these people what kind of serious skanky.
What do you have to say, bitch? What kind of, you are a creep, you know that? You are drama. You crawl up all the asses of drama.
For sure.
In this fucking community, bitch.
For sure, I am.
I don't know you jack shit, motherfucker. You go around.
Oh, that's your real voice. Everybody, that's your
Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce yourself to Lemonade's real voice. Yes. Because when we all get mad, that's our real voice.
Hey, Saggy Boots, I need you to
Saggy Boots, and you're sorry, my pussy's still not, yours is not. Right? Because you're.
I'm sure you're the apostle. Because I'm talking to you right now.
No.
You're older than her, you idiot.
Okay.
You're older than her. Older than me, idiot.
I'm sorry, what?
your pussies. That's
You're older than me, and I don't know why.
I'm sorry, I can't.
Vagina.
I'm older than you.
Yeah, you are.
That's funny.
Listen,
That is so funny. That is so funny.
when she said her real voice,
Oh my god.
when she started talking in her real voice, I swear to God, I thought someone knew. I thought someone knew.
Randy. You lying ass bitch. You
What
are
am I
not
about?
30, honey.
What are you talking about?
Are you in your 30s?
Why do you? Okay, one.
I'm not older
Care
than
how
you.
old I am. You act like I don't know what.
Oh my god. What do I act like? What do I act like, honey?
You act like a whore, baby.
Well, unless I got something.
And not just half a whore, a whole whore.
Oh, well, that's fine.
I know it's fine with you. It's fine.
Oh,
No, I'm proud of my age. Exactly.
Well, you don't say that
Not
I'm older than you.
lizard. A not lizard. This is the definition of a lizard. And
Randy looks better
than you, and she's older than you, and you're half her age, and you look like a
I look better right now than you'll ever look in your life.
Oh my god.
Ever. Never.
Too bad your pussy doesn't know.
with the pussy talk again. Keep going, Jamie. You're gonna.
Yes, you are a real weird freaking moron.
Why are you coming at me though? Randy, like you and I don't have a problem.
Because you're easy, girl. That's why you're easy. You're easy.
Well, I am.
Because you came sideways at FOD calling him all derogatory
Him?
names.
Did you call?
That's why.
Did you call?
Understand.
You don't hear me, bitch, but you're gonna hear me when you go to sleep.
Is that okay?
Manson. And again, it's just a way of narrativizing the story. It's not a scientific statement, it's based on, empirical evidence and observation, but it's a way of drawing together a lot of things to make it coherent. And what's coherent to me is that Manson and Hubbard, in all likelihood, so if Hubbard didn't have any overt abuse, which I would say, honestly, if it's just abuse, narcissism is not likely the defensive structure that will emerge. It has to be a lack of parenting that allows the child to develop a self, which you mentioned when you were talking about, but also some kind of vibe, at the very least, that the child is inferior and not important. And that can be done in the midst of what seems to be a very loving household, right? You can have parents who are still together, who aren't violent, they don't drink, but if the parents are narcissistic themselves, or if they're depressed, or they work a lot, or postpartum, mental conditions, or just a variety of different things can actually contribute to the development of narcissistic personality. Now, it's hard to demonstrate that scientifically because it's such a multifactorial sort of descriptive.
In a box throughout their childhood and watch them intently, yeah.
Right, exactly. So we're left to speculate, but that's been my experience clinically, and I would suspect it would be true for Hubbard and for Manson. But Manson actually did go through some actual overt difficulties. And then what happens from the cult leader, that the way I story the situation is they are always grasping for some kind of narcissistic supply, something that makes them able to bolster this false self that helps them to feel like they have a self and feel like they are good enough in the world, while also distracting them from the deep abyss and emptiness. And they don't start out wanting to be a cult leader. What they start out with is they just want some ability to elevate their self in other people's eyes. So, they start off with, say, being a folk singer, like with Charles Manson, and getting people to listen to him sing songs, or L. Ron Hubbard, who wrote books, right? I don't know.
I played the ukulele apparently as a teenager.
Okay, so some kind of accolade, and there would be this vacillation between, like, at times getting enough narcissistic supply where they can feel normal, but then it's not enough. Or they eventually get there and say you're Charles Manson and you have like 10 people who love your music. Well, eventually you get used to it. We get used to anything, right? Like Kanye West. Yeah, Kanye West is, I don't know if he has narcissistic personality, but he
is a high school dropout.
He did succeed a lot and always seemingly wants to, keep succeeding as many successful people do. Anyway, my point is that eventually you habituate to that level of narcissistic supply, and it no longer feels good enough, and so you have to keep increasing. And so you're L. Ron Hubbard, you're thinking, well, how can I get people to be really into my books? Or if you're Manson, it's like, now I need people to listen to me pontificate about Helter Skelter. I need to get, I don't know if he cared about Helter Skelter, but it certainly was the zeitgeist at the time, and he knew that it was an important element to a lot of people in California at the time. And so, Manson, now he's a preacher, and then he has like followers, and then he has to like get them to give away their possessions and live with him, and then he's got to have sex with them, and then he's got to get them to kill. Like every step up the ladder is like just the next progression on, because he's habituated to the current level of narcissistic supply. I don't know that much about Hubbard though. Like, does this apply to L. Ron Hubbard at all?
Very much so. If you look at either my book, Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, or the biographer Russell Miller's Fairface Messiah, which I worked on, you see a man who does inflate, so that in 1950 it's enough to have a room full of people listening to him and be on the bestseller list. By 1967, he has to create an organization that it can take him away from national laws. So he puts to sea so that he can be outside of the, he can do what he wants. And the behavior is marked. When I interviewed people who'd known him in the 1950s, and I interviewed a lot of people, Most of them were, well, you know, you couldn't trust him to do things, and he spent money like water. I heard that phrase a number of times from people. So he had to keep him away from the money. And he made all sorts of inflated promises. But people came away from their meetings with him saying, but, you know, he's an interesting guy, and, you know, he's got some very clever ideas. I mean, Carl Rogers and Fritz Perls both publicly praised Ron Hubbard's ideas. So he impressed some people. But that, you know, he was talking about, you know, dealing with trauma and the, you know, the trauma of childbirth or the trauma of infancy. And that became the trauma of past lives, and that kind of expanded the picture. But by the 60s, he's inflicting trauma. He's taking these people, putting them in uniforms, putting them on a ship, and throwing them over a diving board in a swimming pool. And there were people who couldn't swim. He was putting a child as young as 4 into the chain lockers in his ship, you know, the place where the anchor chain is normally stored, which is a filthy, squat little place full of bilge water and rats. And he was exerting this dominance over the people around him. So yeah, there was a progression with Hubbard. And I think probably with any of the cult leaders, Hubbard in 1954, he wrote a thing he called The Hymn of Asia. And I talked with his editor and publisher, John Sanborn, who controlled all of the publications from 54 to 1978. And Sanborn said he didn't dare publish this thing because it was too embarrassing, because in it, Hubbard claimed to be Maitreya, the future Buddha who will save all of humanity and take us all into nirvana. And I'd just like to point out, it didn't happen. You know, Hubbard's dead and we're still here. But Sanborn told me that the poem begins with, "Am I Maitreya?" the future Buddha. And he said, the original said, "I am Maitreya." No. That's why John held it for 20 years before publishing it, because of the massive egotism involved in this thought. And I think that he vacillated between believing he was the savior of all humanity and believing he was a complete charlatan. And I have records of conversations that he had with people. The guy interviewed him and made a wonderful little documentary, which is up on YouTube, called The Shrinking World of L. Ron Hubbard. It's only 20 minutes long. And this guy, Charlie Nairn, went and interviewed him, and he said, for an hour or two before the camera went on, Hubbard talked with him, and he said to him, "It's a complete scam, isn't it?" And Hubbard went, "Yeah, of course." Just admitted it. And so Charlie said, "Well, why do you do it?" He said, "Well, it's great to be able to give your wife $10,000 every evening on a silver tray and say, look what we earned today. This is 1968, $10,000 then $100,000 now, every day." But the main thing is I like to hook the clever ones and reel them in. So this idea of being better than other people, controlling other people, believing himself to be godlike, superhuman, I think was essential to his ego construction. And as you say, there's no self involved, because that is not a realistic expectation for a human being. You know, we are fallible. We have our strengths and we have our weaknesses. He had to be considered, you know, a great musician. He made an album called The Power of Source, which was atrocious. He took 2 years of Chick Corea's life to make an appalling pop album called Road to Freedom, which was one of his final legacies before he died. It even has him singing, which is definitely thank you for listening. I wrote just you. It's very worth buying.
Is it on the internet?
Oh, probably. I haven't looked, but I remember cringing when I first heard it, and the thought that a great musician like Chick Corea had wasted so much of his time working on this awful thing was, you know, quite embarrassing. But you know, that's for Chick to work out, and not for me.
So I just want to chime in here and say that the vast majority of people who suffer from narcissistic personality, or what many experts, clinicians would, assess as such, do not do these kinds of things. They might emotionally abuse people around them. They're prone to relationship difficulties, but the vast majority are not cult leaders, wouldn't even try, and definitely are not murderers like Charles, or involve themselves in murdering like Charles Manson did. But that isn't to say that Charles Manson and Hubbard aren't good examples of where narcissistic personality can go.
And the narcissism, I mean, there is a spectrum, and I think, I very much like the idea of looking at any disorder on a spectrum. And so Robert Hare, who wrote the Hare Psychopathy Checklist Revised, which is the one that's being used these days, he eventually changed his mind about terminology in Without Conscience, his book in the early 90s. He dismisses the term sociopath and says that's people who believe that this is something that is socially constructed, that such people are made, whereas he at that time believed that the psychopath is born. And I think, I keep recently citing Shakespeare. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. And I think this is true of almost any psychiatric or psychological disorder, that you can be born with it. Your environment can make it happen to you, or it can be just shoved into you. And with narcissism, as you're saying, there are good grounds to believe that your childhood nurture is a very significant, probably the most significant part of it. However, there is a great... Hare changed his mind. And in the book Snakes in Suits, he says, well, I'm going to say that anybody who scores from 30 to 40, and 40 is the highest mark you can get, on his checklist is a psychopath. Anybody who scores from 4, which is what apparently normal male scores, to 30 is a sociopath of some order or another. And the characteristics of narcissistic personality disorder are characteristics of sociopathy and psychopathy, both of which terms are now excluded from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the APA, which is quite interesting. So we have many, many different opinions, but you will find the same selfishness, the same risk-taking, the same charm in all of these people. It would appear from Kenneth Kyle's work, and he wrote an excellent book called The Psychopath Whisperer, that there is a physiological basis for what we would call criminal psychopathy, the murderers, the people who are in prison. He found that there was a deficit in the paralimbic system in the brain, basically connecting the old limbic brain to the prefrontal cortex. Apparently that deficiency is around about 7%. Got to love numbers, haven't we? But he did very fine resolution fMRIs on hundreds of people held in prisons to come to this idea. But at the other end, you have somebody like, say, James Fallon. Fallon wrote a wonderful book called The Psychopath Inside. And he basically, he's a neuroscientist and professor in California. And he runs 2 institutes that are dealing with genetics. And he had his family scanned to see if anybody had Alzheimer's plaque visible. And he had the 10 images randomized, and he saw on one of them this deficit in the paralimbic system. And he said to his assistant, oh, who's that? And the assistant kind of went, well, actually, that's you, Jim. And has written this, like I said, Psychopath Inside, a wonderful book where he says that he calls himself a pro-social sociopath. The reason I think this is wonderful is that he's a man who admits that he does do the things that a sociopath does. He took his brother on a trip to the Marburg caves in Kenya, not telling his brother this is where Marburg Ebola came from. And his brother realized it when he got home. He says, if he's meant to be going to a funeral and you invite him to a party, he'll go to the party. If you go out for an evening's entertainment with him and you're a bespectacled professor, you will end up drunk and dancing naked on a table. You know, he admits to a degree of mischief. But he says that his whole life, until he was about 50 years old, he believed everything was genetic. There was nothing you could do about it. And his experience, he also has all three of the alleles that are associated with psychopathy. His mother told him that on his father's side, there were 7 murderers in the family, including Lizzie Borden, apparently. And that she had realised when he was like 2 years old that there was something wrong with him. And so by very careful nurture, she managed to produce somebody who had this characteristic innately, these characteristics innately, but was able to modify them to actually become a tremendously helpful human being. He's done great things with his life. So, you know, I'm hesitant that we might start some kind of witch hunt. You know, Hubbard decided there were people who are suppressive persons, and I don't want to get into that simplistic mindset. We don't necessarily know what to do with them yet, but there are ways of approaching this problem of labeling these people and understanding them.
Right. My understanding of the research regarding the limbic system connection with the rest of the brain and executive functioning is that, and again, we just have to say our science is not good enough to understand brain and personality. We're heading in the direction, but I'm positive 100 years from now we're going to laugh at the kinds of things that we were saying about, not necessarily wrong, but at least uninformed by the things they'll know in the future. But anyway, the notion goes that when you are born with the inability to feel fear or to allow fear to guide your development, that one of the ways that our child development is modulated is through the fear of disappointing your parents or the fear of your parents being upset at you. We want to please our parents, and it's very frightening to a child to incur disappointment or to incur anger from a parent. And one of the problems, if you don't have that innate ability, say at the age of 2, 3, 4, that you don't feel fear in general, because that's another thing that's often associated with psychopathy, is this fearlessness, this ability to just like jump off a building and not really care, because you just don't, you're not frightened in the way that other people are, or at least doesn't guide your behavior in the way it does for other people. And so you don't develop correctly, because when your parent turns to you're about to hit your younger sister over the head with a plate, and your parents will react emotionally. They don't just say, "Okay, Johnny, don't do that." They freak out. Like, "What are you doing?" And for most kids, that fear will be, that emotionality will be detected by the child, and it'll actually scare the child. They'll have a physical scare, like what's happening? My parents are freaking out. And they'll associate hitting someone over the head with a plate with intense fear for themselves. And so the next time they think about hitting someone over the head with a plate, they actually will worry physically about the consequences of doing that. If you don't have fear, then you don't care. You see your parents freaking out, and you're like, "Huh, that's interesting." And then you hit your sibling over the head with a plate, and then that creates a whole other set of developmental experiences where the parents are now looking at you like, "What's wrong with you?" And so that creates a whole other set of weird experiences that can develop later into a life where the person just doesn't really have the empathy that other people have. And it's an interesting model of how we develop empathy, that is modulated and developed through a fear response, right? That our morality is somehow at the foundation is some kind of fear of retribution from our parents or God or something, Now, again, it's just a metaphor based on our very limited understanding of how things are going.
And And again, there might be a spectrum that we don't simply learn through our anxiety of learning that a behaviour is right or wrong. On the work done on the brain, of course, much of this is work on the amygdala, amygdalae, done by Joseph Ledoux and Bessel van der Kolk. And Ledoux, 2 or 3 years ago, actually withdrew his findings. They're still being cited as the basis, usually. But he feels that he may have overestimated some of these effects. And we're now hearing this term brain blob, the notion that specific regions of the brain are responsible for specific activities may not be universally true.
Right.
So yes, there are some questions. I would question the idea that there are simply fear responses. There are also empathy responses. And Simon Baron-Cohen, in his work, 0 Degrees of Empathy, he's, of course, one of the leading workers on the autistic spectrum and understanding that. And he talks about sociopaths being people who have, or psychopaths or narcissists, people who have a cognitive empathy, that they understand what other people are feeling, whereas people with Asperger's or on the autistic spectrum have difficulty in understanding how to react to people's feelings. Psychopaths have a really finely tuned sense of that. At the other end of the scale, on the autistic spectrum and with Asperger's, people tend to have very high affective empathy. They feel things very profoundly. This is the bit that's missing, not just the fear response, but the empathy. That the psychopath is like, well, yeah, and so you read stories of interviews with criminal psychopaths where, the one I remember from Ken Keel is he actually prints the interview, gives the words of the guy, said, well, this guy was in prison because he killed somebody, he hit somebody, knocked them off a barroom stool, banged their head, and they were dead. And there he is in prison. And he just says to the interviewer, which would probably kill himself, well, if you'd seen the way he looked at me, you'd have killed him too. That lack of any response, not just fear, but a lack of empathy, the lack of emotion, which we learn culturally from our parents, as you say, by them being decent people. And let me tune in and say that I was very fortunate to grow up in a loving family with loving parents and 3 loving brothers. So I, as you said of your own upbringing, this isn't something that happened to me, and my empathy for others was there from the beginning. It was always the feeling of not so much thou shalt not behave in this way, but it's better to behave in this way. My parents were very honest, very honourable, very considerate people, and so that seemed the natural way to go. On top of that, I'm agnostic now, but until the age of 13, I was Christian. I was brought up within Christianity, and the positive moral notions of Christianity, like giving all you have to the poor, for example. I haven't seen a lot of people doing that. But the positive, the golden rule, which Buddhism also has, of doing to other people what you'd like them to do to you, was something that was part of my normal life. When I was 4 or 5, that was the way you behaved towards people. It was, in fact, only as an adult, and after the harassment I received from Scientology, that I started to think, should I really be sacrificing my life to help people I've never met? Which is the basis of that idea, and I'm not sure that they should actually, but yeah. So I think there's a positive and a negative. It's not just the fear response. There's also something that I think is really positive in this regard, which you probably know about, the Mendota Juvenile Treatment Centre. It's been said for years that there's nothing you can do about this condition. But in the early 90s, in Wisconsin, they actually did a massive study where they separated 2 groups of juveniles who'd committed criminal acts, and the one set were the control group, and they were just left in the normal reform system. And the other group had very intensive counselling and support, and they found in the follow-up that, because it's always been thought there's nothing you can do about this, they found in the follow-up that in fact the control group did some pretty nasty things, but the kids who'd been through this program had a much, much lower recidivism rate. So that, I think there were 16 murders committed by members of the control group, and I'm not sure there were any by the other group. That's talked about in Ken Peele's book, Psychopath Whisperer.
Yeah, I think that the way
there is something that can be done, which is really important.
Right. The way that people see people with narcissistic personality or antisocial is that the way that they talk about them, and even clinicians, it's like they're an alien race from Mars or something.
Witches.
Yeah, they're us. We are them. They're human beings. And although some of the things that they think or do are very foreign to the average person, they still share most of their basic humanness with the rest of us, meaning that they appreciate being comfortable, for example. They don't like to be in prison. They appreciate, to some extent, people who approve of them. They're not like completely like just divorced from actual human interaction or being interested in pleasing other people. Now, they might have
take pleasure in life. Yeah.
Right. They might have some very deep defenses and resentments against people developed through life, or maybe they were born with something that made it harder for them. But they also do have sort of a version of empathy in a sense. They're not just completely divorced from that. Now, for some of them, the way that they will choose to see certain behaviors, often involve some of their defenses, or they don't have the same mechanisms that other people have that will drive behavior. But they're not completely different from us. Therefore, when they are suffering and we are talking to them, and they can, when we listen, and they get some emotional regulation skills, they get some support, they get some life skills, they're connected to someone who believes in them. There are natural things that are going to be beneficial to any human, and people with psychopathy are no different. Now, are some people with psychopathy so hell-bent on not letting anything like this work and so hell-bent on harming other people? Yes. And some who have extremely destructive urges of sadism and raping other people and this kind of thing. Absolutely, there are decidedly monsters, but they're humans, but at the same time, those aren't the people that are in a study. The vast majority of these kinds of people are, I believe, reachable, and have been reached according to evidence.
We need a better understanding. I don't remember his name, but the chap who wrote Amazing Grace, the song Amazing Grace, was the captain of a slave ship who had realised that was really not a good thing to have been doing. And it shows that somebody who has done atrocious and dreadful things, in his case it was through a religious conversion, but they can understand what they've done, they can take responsibility for it. That can happen. But I do think that for anybody, for those of us with sort of regular empathy, we understand the emotional consequences of what we do. And people can tell us that we're upsetting other people, and that will possibly distress us, and we won't want to do it. If you're dealing with somebody who doesn't care about upsetting other people, then you have to frame it in a way that the consequences upon them, how will it affect them? That if they upset other people, the consequence will be those people won't spend time with them, won't buy the products from them, or whatever. Understanding things in a more selfish way. I think there's another thing, the high risk taking is one of the things that fascinates me about the whole of the psychopathic construction, that maybe these are people who don't have an easy dopamine release. Maybe they don't get pleasure easily. The reward system in the brain is not functioning. So they have to do more extreme things to get a sensation. You know, in the same way that people who are significantly masochistic in their sexual behaviour, you know, you hear about people who deliberately go out to get themselves beaten up because that gives them pleasure. You know, so having their bones broken. I met a young man like this when I was a teenager and found it very shocking when he told me that he joined a motorcycle gang so that they would beat him up because he liked that. But things can go wrong in the wiring of the brain, and the dopamine, serotonin, whatever responses can be the wrong way on. So we might even be looking at something physiological there that we might be able to do something about. Until we can do something about it, if somebody is a criminal psychopath, we need to separate them from the population.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's, you know, just because, and that's often what people will confuse with it. You know, if I'm claiming that they're not from Mars, somehow they're like, well, what is supposed to forgive them? I'm like, no, absolutely. Like, if they're gonna, you know, the justice system is there for a reason. We sort of drifted into psychopathy. I want to get back to narcissism because, you know, they're different. They're related on some level, but they're really quite different experiences in my clinical experience. What other figures have you studied? David Koresh, do you want to talk about Donald Trump? Other kinds of people, who else have you looked into? You mentioned the movie.
Let's talk about Donald Trump quickly. The guy who wrote the entry for narcissistic personality disorder in DSM-4 actually published an article appeared in New Scientist some time ago saying, you know, Donald Trump does not have the narcissistic personality disorder. I'm the guy that wrote the entry, and I can tell you. Now, he also talks about, you know, the rule that you shouldn't diagnose somebody that you haven't interviewed. Is that the Goldman rule or something?
Yeah.
And, you know, so I'd like to point out that he hadn't interviewed Donald Trump, so he couldn't diagnose him one way or the other. But I think that, you know, this casual, you know, the division that's happened in the United States, which has been going on for a long time, but it really does seem rather toxic now. You know, we hate Donald Trump because of this. It's certainly not for me, and not for, you know, public untrained people. You know, you're in a situation where you have some training to look at this. I don't. And I think this, you know, howling about him being a narcissist, you know, having NPD is, you know, not necessarily helpful.
No, it's highly problematic, and yeah, not only just ethically speak, have a line, and it's there for a reason. It's a fairly obvious line. It's like, if you haven't assessed someone, you can't diagnose them. Pretty easy thing to say. You know, a physician can't look at someone across the road and say that person has lung cancer. You know what I mean? It's like, you just can't do that. And the rule applies here. And then, you know, it's just obviously a bias. And every president has had some clinicians who have diagnosed them with NPD, and it's like, it just becomes meaningless. You know, it's just evidence of your partisanship, as far as I'm concerned.
At Emory University, while Obama was still president, assessed every president up to Obama and determined that all of the popular ones were narcissists.
Right. I mean, even Chester Arthur, one of the presidents people don't even remember, you know, was diagnosed as having narcissistic personality disorder. And I just find that to be, one, unethical, two, just completely wrong-headed, because, again, that's a gross misunderstanding of narcissistic personality. Now, if you think the person's arrogant, that's a non-clinical statement. You can just be like, you know, Donald Trump is arrogant, or Donald Trump is self-centered. It's like, okay, you know, it's fine. There's not a clinical statement there. That's an opinion. It's a descriptive adjective. It's fine. You could also say Donald Trump's a jerk. You know, there's no DSM diagnosis for being a jerk.
Not yet.
You can say that. But to claim that you know, one, what narcissistic personality disorder is, which alone is quite a claim, even within clinicians, I find that people don't understand it. And two, that you could actually assess someone by watching, you know, Fox News is just absurd.
And it doesn't seem to be that whenever a medical term enters popular culture, it's immediately misdefined. So schizophrenic is held by most people to mean multiple personality.
Right. OCD means you're clean.
Yes, exactly. You watch. People are called paranoid when they're actually anxious. You know, these words, the word depressed, instead of saying, somebody saying, oh, I was unhappy, I was sad, they'll go, I was depressed. And you go, well, do you mean endogenous depression or reactive depression? And obviously they give you a funny look. What are you talking about? Because it's only endogenous or internally generated depression that is depression. If your girlfriend's just left you, or your boyfriend or whatever has just left you, you're not depressed, you're unhappy. That's what's called a reactive depression. But these terms, I suppose they make us sound as if we know what we're talking about. It bothers me that so many authors these days start talking about the brain, and they start saying this or that about the amygdala
or left brain, right brain, or something.
Left brain, right brain, from those early 60s studies where the corpus callosum was cutting epileptics.
Yeah.
And I love the work of Robert A. Burton. He wrote a book called, he was the head of neurology at Mount Sinai, UC San Francisco. And he wrote a book called On Being Certain, which is mind-boggling. It's just a wonderful book about why are we so sure of things? You know, what do we believe and what do we actually know? And then he wrote a book called A Skeptic's Guide to the Brain. And in that, he criticizes what he considers the overly positive assertions of most of the workers in this field, including, say, Damasio and Ramachandran. He doesn't say anything about Oliver Sacks, because we would never criticize Oliver Sacks. And he's not saying their work is wrong. He's saying they're a bit overconfident about what this means. You know, it sounds as if we know more than we do. And it's the point of view that you put at the start of this conversation, that we know some things, and in 100 years' time, people will look back and say, as they do in Sleeper, you mean they didn't know that burgers and fries are the basis of a healthy diet?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm interested in picking up some of those books. So we got Donald Trump off the list. Now, in my deep dives on narcissistic personality, actually, after seeing all that kind of stuff right there, which I go on for a while, I actually do kind of go through some things that we have seen from him that you could say, well, maybe, but there's really no way to know. And if I had data on Obama, I could, sort of say the same thing. But anyway, so if you want to listen to that, you can listen to those episodes. But the point is that I want to get to
we all will.
is what other figures, because I'm guessing for people that understand these sort of extreme examples of, shall we say, extreme narcissistic personality people who actually involve themselves in cults to, give them their narcissistic supply. Who else could you point to?
Well, the great leaders of the 20th century cults, Adolf Hitler provides quite a study. That here is a man who fits the classic pattern that he was abused throughout his childhood. He was rejected when he wanted to go and be an art student. As the producers points out, he was a great painter. He could do a whole apartment, 2 coats in a single afternoon. And when you look at his early, his career as a soldier, he was called the White Crow by his fellows. He was a corporal. He won the Iron Cross for bravery. But nobody liked him. And that's something about Hubbard, that looking at his childhood and later, he seemed to have these very close relationships, or what seemed to be close relationships, with individuals for a very short period of time. So, for 6 months when he was in East Princeton in the 1963, in one lecture after another, he talks about his great friend Reg Sharp. And Sharp, a year later, is thrown out, having written a book that's published by Scientology. So they take people to them and they sort of empirically suck them dry. Hitler too would, have a close confederate, there are many examples, but Eric Röhm, the head of the SA, which was the group of thugs that put Hitler into power, no two ways about that, and he has them all murdered with nice long knives, and replaces him with Himmler and the SS, Schutzstaffen. So, and maybe it's true of Mao Zedong, that if we look at him, it's been said that he spent most of his reading time was not reading Marxist literature, but reading histories of the emperors of China, and that he considered himself an emperor. And when you look at the way the Cultural Revolution happened, the first of the student revolutions of the 60s, he kickstarted that. He's the guy that went to the, having stood back from power at that point, he then gets the students to, they killed tens of thousands of people. They buried their university professors alive. Things have got bad in the US sometimes, but you've not seen anything on that sort of scale. And it seems to me that it was about his image. It was about him being perceived as this god among men, which of course he achieved. To this day in China, there are still massive posters of Mao Zedong, and he's considered to be this great liberator, though of course he's the greatest mass murderer in all history, probably. Genghis Khan did pretty well too, but it's estimated that over 20 million people.
Yeah, so it's interesting about Hitler. I haven't studied him as much as you have, but being, on this planet, growing up in this time, you just can't get away with knowing some things. And it's interesting to look, again, it's from afar, so there's no way to know for sure, but it's interesting to think about him through the narcissistic personality lens. Yeah. Someone who was very interested in being, because he was suffering deeply on the inside, which I think there's evidence of, right?
Absolutely. Oh, and how? He was, his doctor's notebooks became available only a couple of years ago, and we find that he was on a massive dose of amphetamines on a daily basis. So he will have been a very unhappy bunny. He was also the first person to have fecal transplant, which is a questionable practice, which is now going all over the West, where you take bowel material from a healthy person and put it in the bowel of an unhealthy person in the hope that whatever's in there will do some good. Well, his doctor records making little pills from SS men's excrement, which Hitler would swallow. So his doctor wasn't necessarily very helpful either, but no, he was a very unhappy man. He was a very ill man. And there's this peculiar situation when you look at the Nazi system. He was a very lazy man. That was the other thing that I got about Hubbard, that he spent a great deal of time on holiday. He spent a great deal of time just sitting around doing nothing. And then he'd go and give 3 40-minute lectures in a week, and that would be him done. Hitler too spent most of his time reading the newspapers and would let his Gauleiters, his followers, battle it out between them. So there are many comparisons that could be made.
Right, and so again, through the lens, again, it's just narrativizing something that's hard for us to know for sure, but he it doesn't go well for him as a painter, and you just wonder about the world if he had been accepted in art school. But he turns to, I'm sure there's a lot of detail in terms of like his path, but eventually he finds himself in politics, and he finds that he can actually get quite a bit of narcissistic supply by getting people to listen to him talk and by getting people to support his political opinion.
Is this your problem?
And he saw a niche at the time in history in Germany. They were reeling from the economic troubles after World War I, and from the lack of feeling like Germany was on the decline. Make Germany great again was his slogan, I'm sure. And he was, he was very good at knowing how to get people to respond to him. He was a master at propaganda, him and his close compadres. and was, like, I can't remember if this is true, maybe you know, but there's evidence or maybe speculation that, he would practice in the mirror how to look as he gave speeches.
I was just about to talk about that. In 1927, Hitler published a series of studio portraits, which were taken by Heinrich Hoffmann, who would be his personal photographer from then to his death. And they are a series of poses. This was a massive bestseller eventually in Germany. Sorry, the photos were taken in 1927. They were published in 1931. And they're pictures of him pulling faces and, making gestures, exactly as you say. He practiced in the mirror. And if you watch Triumph of the Will, and I think everybody should watch Triumph of the Will, it's a remarkable piece of documentary making, very innovative. But it also, when Leni Riefenstahl talked about making that film, she said that it took 6 months to edit, 3 days to film, 6 months to edit, because he kept picking his nose, or so he had a set of rehearsed gestures that he would fall out of, and then he'd go back into them. So yeah, he designed a persona to impress. You can look at the same thing with Margaret Thatcher, and I'm not for a moment suggesting that Margaret Thatcher was or wasn't a narcissistic personality, but if you watch film of her before she became leader of the Conservative Party in Britain, she has a different voice. She has a different posture. She was trained to, talk down to people in a certain way and to walk and carry herself in a different way. And that, I think that is part of, in her case, it was political expediency. She was the first British politician to hire an advertising agency. And every one of them since has hired an advertising agency. And I think that leads us into this area where narcissism has become popular. I hear about the sociopath sites where, your girlfriend's broken up with you and you never want to be hurt again. So you can go to this site and they will train you into having no emotions. They'll train you into never being hurt again. And I think because our society is so narcissistic and it rewards them.
Call from.
Hello?
To accept, press 1. To send a voicemail, press 2. Okay, I sent the caller a voicemail. Goodbye.
Hello?
Alright.
Are you okay?
Yeah, I just got here. No thanks to the stupid math didn't work.
Oh no.
That's okay. I just kind of estimated and guesstimated. Took a nice tour
Oh god.
of Lowell, which is a lovely place.
Oh no.
I'm here now. That's all that matters. I'm gonna look around.
You're gonna look around?
Well, I was hoping that there might be a cart.
Yeah, there's a cart and there's also a freight elevator.
I'm not gonna fuck with that.
Okay. Well, there are that's where like the dollies and stuff are usually by the freight elevator, which is like by the bar, which is like if you're facing the entrance, it's to your right.
Okay.
And to get back, you just go, you go out and take a left. Wait.
I'm already probably lost,
It's real easy.
Okay.
You're right off the highway.
Yeah.
You just go get on where 7-Eleven is. I'm just always dyslexic about it because you can go either way out of Western Ave. And I forget which way I go because I go both ways. But if you go right, then you go onto School Street. If you go right on that street, then you go. See, actually, I think you should go left. Lil Babe, what is wrong with you? Lil Babe is like ferociously chewing on one plastic bag in particular all of a sudden. Which I don't know why.
Interesting.
He's suddenly very alert.
So does that freight elevator only go to the second floor? The first stop is the second floor? Or no, it goes to the basement?
It goes to the 5th floor.
Well, I know it goes up, but where would you say the push carts would be? The vicinity of?
On the first,
no way to know.
On the ground floor.
Uh-huh.
Did you get in yet?
Yeah, I'm in there.
Okay, thank God.
Yeah, thank God it's right.
I was so scared that some like kind of freak thing would happen. Like when, because I thought I lost my key because it came off my thing at one point. And that was my nightmare, was that you would get there and then be like, I can't get in. And that would just be horrible. So,
yeah.
That's good.
But I found a pallet jack.
A pallet jack?
Yeah.
Okay.
You know what? I think this belongs to the glass people.
What would you use it for?
I just throw a bunch of boxes on it and load it up with stuff.
Well,
oh wait, I see stuff up here. Okay, what you didn't tell me, what I don't understand is there's a bay door in here where you can drive into the freight elevator area. I see it now.
Yeah.
Now I'm going from the hallway up above, and there's all kinds of shit here. There's all the perfect elite pins. Perfect. I'm good now.
The what? The wheelie bins?
These rolling bins.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to tell you.
I know. Like
any of that stuff you can use, just bring it back to that area.
It's fine.
Huh?
It said that's fine.
Oh.
So now I go back through the building to the other elevator.
What?
Now I walk back through the building. Right?
Well, I mean, you can use, yeah, are you going to go up in the
park where we always go in?
Well, you can park over by the freight elevator and go up that way, and then yeah, you just have to wheel. You have to go through the building, yeah, because it's on the other side.
Right. Okay. I was just trying to figure out where I was. Doesn't seem like I've been through the whole building yet.
Yeah, you just go to the left and you keep going. I mean, you won't miss my spot. I don't think. There's so much poop on this bed.
I'm at a dead end with no elevator. I gotta go.
What?
I gotta let you go.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Oh God, my body is killing me. I need more water. I need a lot more water.
Narcissism. You know, we admire people because they're selfish, because they're greedy. You know, the movement in this society in the last 40 years has been phenomenal. Naomi Klein reported that in 1980, when Ronald Reagan became president, the average CEO earned 40 times what a blue-collar worker would earn. By 2000, it was 411 times. So we've seen this creation of these super rich people who are kind of expected to be narcissistic. They're kind of expected to be Kim Kardashian or whatever and to behave in this way publicly. And I don't see that as a failure in religious morality, as many people do. I see it as a lack of a compass, as a lack of understanding that to be a happy human being, you know, Fromm criticized Freud for saying selfish people only love themselves, and said, no, they don't love anybody, they can't love themselves, as I said before. And I think that this, you know, that developing a self is a way of becoming autonomous emotionally and intellectually, is a way of being happy. It's a way of, you know, being as content and comfortable as we can in the world. Whereas developing narcissism, you are bound to lose. You are bound to come a cropper if you develop these negative traits. Because how can you like anything if your whole being is focused upon being adulated, you know, and being important and significant?
Yeah, and being superior to others and dominating and you know, not having a reciprocal, you know, attuned, liked relationship between you and someone else, but one that is more unidirectional, right? And that's really the tragedy of the narcissistic personality, is that by attempting to defend against a deep emptiness that can only really be filled by actual connection with other people and people mirroring them, they defend against that deep emptiness by propping up this false self. And what this requires is that they have to socialize other people to prop it up as well. And this pushes people away, or at the very least prevents them from, you know, really caring for who you are on the inside. You know, they might like you from what you're presenting, but narcissistic personality people, when they really think about it, when they're really faced with it, you know, I think with Hubbard was an example of this, they realize, like, look, these people don't like me. They like this version of me. And this is just more evidence that I inherently deep down am an unlovable, inferior, empty shell of a human being. And that's the true tragedy of this. And without any guidance, without any understanding of this, that they just continue to suffer and or abuse people along the way, and maybe even create future generations of people with narcissistic personality. It's really a tragedy. And when we're on the internet, just sort of throwing around narcissistic personality, and labeling everyone like this, it diminishes it and makes it seem that the way people talk about it in the media is basically just like, well, I don't like what this person is doing, and they annoy me, and I'm jealous, and I wish that they weren't famous or something. It's just some kind of weird narcissistic reaction in and of itself. Like I envy this person's fame and their power, and I need some way of tearing them down. So I'll just claim that they're a narcissist, and then that will elevate me because I've now demeaned them. Now I'm superior to Kanye West because he's a narcissist. And what it ends up doing is everyone's missing the point that the people with narcissism are suffering deeply, and if we can actually access that, and I have clinically, I have people who have full-blown NPD, and there's a way of accessing their true self. It takes a long time, and there's a lot of distrust and a lot of resentment and a lot of things you have to wade through, and they will present in ways that can be quite troublesome because they come across like they don't care about people. They do. They just have trouble accessing that, and then the cycle just can be broken. You can actually help someone to recover and hopefully stop hurting other people along the way. Anyway, I'm rambling, but
no, I think it's a very interesting ramble. I think what you're saying is possibly the most important thing that we've said, that you have personal experience where you've been able to help people who have this disorder to come to terms with it and live a better life. And that's fantastically important. That's remarkably important.
Well, you're giving me my narcissistic supply, John.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we're going to build you up. You're going to be 19 feet tall by the time. We have one of our members of our advisory board, Dan Shaw, wrote a book called Traumatizing Narcissists, which is fairly technical, but pretty interesting. He was a member of a Hindu-based cult as a young man, and so he has that perspective, and he's helped a lot of people recover from their cultic experiences. But he sees the cult leader or the abusive spouse in a very similar light. It's just the scale of what they're able to do that they're narcissistic. And I think that the essence of which we're agreeing on, is that these people they'll destroy the people around them, and they'll destroy themselves. And so getting it over that there is a way that you can find help, and that if your life is influenced by a narcissist, then understanding, you can still love somebody who's a narcissist, but you need to understand them. I have a counsellor friend who, when somebody comes to her and they'll say they're depressed or they're anxious or what have you, one of the first questions is, are you involved with a difficult person? And it's just a beautiful choice of word that, she's not making some malevolent judgment about this person. She's saying, is there somebody difficult in your life? And often people will, if you said, well, you're living with a narcissist or a psychopath, they just clam up. But if you say a difficult person, then they'll say, well, yes, actually, my husband is a bit difficult. And then you can say, in what way are they difficult? And you can, without making those judgments, you can get that material out there. So, which is to say that actually a huge amount of people are involved in abusive relationships, whether it be with a political group or a pseudo-religious group. I mean, we're at Open Minds Foundation at the moment, we have a real focus on why don't people report child abuse? You know, we're looking at these massive scandals. In the Roman Catholic Church, 8,000 children were abused by 500 priests in Australia alone. 34 bishops have just offered their resignations in May in Chile because they covered up the rape of children. And a new scandal has just broken about a home for children in Scotland run by the Catholic Church, where children were being systematically abused. But it's also happened in the Anglican Church, it's also happened in the Methodist Church. The Jehovah's Witnesses allegedly have a list of 23,000 abusers, the names they will not release to legal authorities. And they lost a case in 2015 here in England where they were ordered to pay £300,000, about $400,000. To the victim of abuse, because they knew that the person they were putting this then child with was a convicted abuser. You know, they knew that this person had done this. And we then find that they had a recruitment program in prisons where they would find people convicted of child molestation and bring them into the congregation and then give them access to children. We've had it in the Boy Scouts, we've had it in cadets, we've had it in football coaching. We're seeing this in children's homes all over the world. Why don't people report this? Because starting case in the UK was Jimmy Savile, the obscene disc jockey, who is said to have been involved in at least 500 cases of abuse of people from the age of 2 to the age of 90. He was given the keys to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital so that he could wander at will through there. He was supported by Margaret Thatcher, he was supported by Edwina Currie, who was the Minister for Health, I think, at the time. And we now find that there were hundreds of complaints against him that the police just ignored because he was Jimmy Savile. So the thing I'm working on at the moment, we've just published a book called Uncensored by a woman called Barbara Anderson, who left the Jehovah's Witnesses when she realised the cover-up. And we're working with a group called SCARS in the US, that's SCAARS. They're seeking to change legislation in the US concerning child abuse. You know, for one thing, we like to be rid of any statute of limitations on this. But I would like to see naming and shaming of people, particularly in official positions, who failed to do anything. We had cases where 13-year-old girls here were being brought into prostitution rings, particularly by groups of Kashmiri men, in nearly 20 UK cities. And one police force received 83 complaints, which they didn't investigate because they thought it would be racist to investigate these Kashmiris for some reason. And they believed that the 13-year-old girls had given their consent as if they could. You know, they were being plied with vodka and used as prostitutes. So changing that culture and saying, let's have a culture where if you see something that's going wrong, you report it, and that you persist with the report. This is something, the Open Minds Foundation, we're pushing towards at the moment, and we're hoping to have some effect upon that.
Yeah, that's great. I'd be really curious to read what you find regarding the factors involved in the lack of reporting. Yeah, you know, you touched on a lot of it, because I've thought about it too. I was just like, why? You know, because if we think about other kinds of crimes, say, you know, a priest decides to, you know, he takes a knife and stabs a kid or something, or he steals something. Yeah, steals something. Push a kid down the stairs. You know, he pushed 10 kids downstairs. It's like, what's the chance that none of them are gonna tell somebody? You know, or the people that they tell are gonna cover it up. You know, you're gonna be like, you're gonna go to the priest like, why are you pushing people down the stairs? Like, that's, you know, we have a zero tolerance policy about pushing parishioners down the stairs. You know, somehow when it comes to sexual abuse, it's just like, just this totally opposite reaction that actually upholds the abuse. And in addition to legislation and the fact that when people actually come forward, they are actually not supported. And so as a victim, if you're contemplating coming forward, you're like, ooh, I don't want any of that stuff. You know, if you get pushed down the stairs and you come forward, you know, 99% of the time they're going to be like, well, that, you know, that's not your fault, and you know, who did this to you? Let's know justice. For whatever reason, when you say I was sexually abused by my priest, there's a good chance that, you know, people are going to push back. They're going to be like, well, do you have proof? You know, are you just saying this? Or, you know, let's look at this little, you know, or, you know, they'll humiliate you and just be like, you're a liar, you're a cunt, you're a slut, or whatever it is. You know, she seduced me or something, you know. And so there's all that. But the other thing that I think is another massive factor is that as a society, I just know about mine here in the Western United States, is, you know, we're still, you know, puritanical about sex. And it's this holdover from hundreds of years ago about, you don't talk about sex, and sex is dirty, and sex is shameful. And now, of course,
I think historically that it's a lot more recent than that. I think it's the late Victorian era in the 19th century. You know, just before Freud realizes it, that sex becomes a taboo. Because if you look into the literature of, you know, say Rabelais in the 17th century, or we look into 18th century practices, sex was a lot more open. Then you got the notions of privacy that came along in middle classes in, you know, the mid-Victorian era, let's say the 1850s. And then this new idea about sex being shameful, because of course most children up until that period living in peasant or poor families, working families, would have known that their parents were having sex, you know, because if you're living in two rooms, there's, you know, not a lot of hiding it. Right. So I think attitudes towards sex were massively shifted, and it may even be that Freud made it worse by making it seem more taboo than it had ever been.
Yeah, that's probably more accurate.
Danger Rome in the 4th century, you know, because Christianity had nothing against sex, really. Jesus doesn't say anything negative, and Mary Magdalene, there is no evidence that she was a prostitute. That was invented somewhere around the 4th century when St. Jerome comes along and says women are bad, wicked, and dirty, and must have anything to do with them. St. Paul did say it's better to marry than to burn. I'm personally not sure. I've been married twice and burned several times. But this emphasis, as you say, has become puritanical. And I think the US is you have this fantastic Puritan legacy from Plymouth Rock onward. I was reading somebody a year or so back talking about when massive banquets became popular in New York in the late 19th century. And so they'd have, 17 courses, but they'd eat them as fast as possible and get indigestion, because it was a bad thing to enjoy yourself. And I think that, there is, whether that's anecdotal or not, there is that conflict in Western culture, that sense of guilt, particularly Protestant guilt.
Right. So, the multiple cultural influences on American society has created just a lot of shame. And since we're generally black and white, animals, we, particularly about some things that are taboo, we just have this heuristic of just like, well, sex is dirty and shameful and should not be talked about. And so when someone comes forward having been sexually abused, the people hearing the reports they just rely on this heuristic of just like, ooh, this is dirty, this is shameful. By even listening to this story, I'm involving myself in something lewd. If I'm interested in it or I pursue justice for it, does this mean I'm a pervert? There's just these really shortcut ways that people will react to things that, take a completely separate situation. Someone comes up to you at work and says, which should be totally fine, by the way, a friend of yours, let's just say a friend of yours comes to you, you go to lunch on Friday and they come to you and they're like, oh my God, I have to tell you about what happened last night. It was really great. And you're like, oh, what? And they're like, me and my spouse had the most amazing, dirty, sweaty sex. Let me tell you about every single detail. Most people would be like, what do you, no, I don't want to, but
put it on YouTube. Don't tell me about it.
Yeah. But, if you talked about like an amazing movie you saw or an amazing meal you had, somehow that's okay. But talking about sex, it's like, no. And so even if it's not even related to sexual abuse, we're like, wait a second. I don't want to hear it. By even listening to this story, what does that mean about me? Am I a dirty, slutty, gross person even by listening to this story? This whole thing grosses me out. And so because of all the messages we've been taught. And so when someone comes to you and says, oh, I'm that whole system kicks in. I need to shut this down. I can't participate. Yeah, that's against their greater judgment around like, wait a second, there's a child there who's being victimized, and a crime that's being committed in the system that needs to change. And so,
I'm so glad you're feeling better, though, I'm so scared.
This week, the documentary has been shown on TV here.
Do you want some more air in there for you?
And it's the story of a spoiling my buzz. I don't want you to talk about that. And I think you're right. This whole attitude.
Why don't you flop?
We need to get through this. The thing that perplexes me the most, and I have had direct dealings with this because people who've been sexually abused, who were sexually abused as children, who were involved in Scientology, have come to me and talked to me about what happened to them. And the thing that I cannot really get past is these children told their parents. The same is true in the Jehovah's Witnesses. The same is true in the Catholic, Anglican, Methodist churches. Let's not disinclude the Tibetan tantric sects and the various Hindu. Wherever you go, there's some version of this going on. The parents have so often been told by the child and convinced by some authority figure in their church or their sports group, whatever the organization is, the Army Cadets, hazing in US universities where people end up dead, some of the things that are done. The parents become involved in the cover-up, and that's the bit I want to get through, to understand how, social compliance, without getting into arguments about thought reform or mind control or what have you, but how regular social compliance leads people in our society to be willing to do that. if somebody messes with, I have 4 children, if somebody messes with one of my 4 children, or indeed my granddaughter, I'm right there. I'm not going to take that. It's not going to happen. When my oldest boy was 8 and came home from school and said that one of his teachers had threatened to strike one of the children, I phoned the headmaster up straight. Well, actually, I phoned up 2 mothers of children, one of whom said, yes, her child has said the same thing. Then I phoned the headmaster, who laughed at me. He actually laughed at me when I said, this woman has threatened to strike a child. And my teacher wouldn't do that. 2 years later, he thanked me. They had to dismiss the teacher because she'd struck a child. But it was, you come up against this wall of disbelief, and hopefully events of the last 10 years will start, the Australian Royal Commission, I think, has been very important in this, will start to make a change so that reports will be taken seriously. 20 years ago, reports of domestic violence were almost ignored by the British police, and I'm sure by police forces in many places. Now the police have been retrained. We have the coercive control aspect of our Criminal Justice Act, which came in December 2015. And, it's accepted that psychologically controlling another person under law in England now, that's a criminal offence. Hitting them, that was already a criminal offence, but controlling, coercing them into doing what you want. We're also recognising, of course, a few weeks ago it was announced that the number of slaves in Britain is probably double what had previously been estimated. And some of these slave situations are domestic situations where, one person has brought another person into a relationship and enslaved them. Which is the extreme of the narcissistic personality disorder making. And people turn a blind eye. They look the other way. And I think the culture is changing. And I think it might be the most positive change that has ever happened in human civilization, where people start to take complete responsibility for children and to protect children. Because just think of the amount of post-traumatic stress that is running all rife through our society because of this abuse, because of these poor people who have to then live with the after effects of being raped and abused as children.
And the trauma, sometimes worse, of the reaction once they come forward by their parents or their friends or the police or the justice system or prosecutors or whatever. The reaction can be much worse, because to me it's always been like, well, yeah, there's some bad apples in the world that will treat me and other people badly, but to be let down by the general population and to be let down by the police system, the justice system, and your family, and that is so much more scary and traumatic. But well, John, I want to let you go because we got to save some of your golden nuggets for the next time we talk.
But let me just make a positive comment, having been so negative about Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Let me say that Pope Francis has said that it is a responsibility for all of us to take on the problem of child abuse and end it. So, I'm with Pope Frank on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And, most people want to do something, but we have systems and culture that, pushes against our better nature.
And I think the thing is that we need to take hold and do something. At the Open Minds Foundation, our situation is we need help. We need contribution. We need people to come and give us a few dollars a month, or, write some positive comments or send us blogs. Because I do think that between us, now that we're understanding this problem at last, and that it is all the way through our society, that between us, there are enough good-hearted people out here to do something.
So nervous when
I
you
think
want a treat.
change is going to come, as the man said in the song.
Yeah. And your organization is there doing your part.
We do our best, but we really do need support and contribution. I've had 4 years of doing this, and I'm exhausted because there is so much to do, and we're now involved with so many people. As I say, with SCARS in the US, with Radicalisation Awareness Network, Exit, which deals with violent extremists, Prevent in the UK. We're trying to forge liaisons with organisations and say, look, and what these organisations tend to be doing, say that you're doing a counter-cult group, they go out and they teach kids about cults, and that's great, but that's not actually going to prevent you from joining a cult. You need to understand about narcissists, psychopaths, what I call human predators, and the techniques that they will use to seduce and recruit you. And by teaching those things to children and the intelligent disobedience that's advocated by my good friend Ira Taylor, by advocating those things, we can actually change society, and we can change it in a single generation. But we need to do something. We need to stop sitting about and chatting about it. Get out there and teach people exactly what you are.
That's why I knew there was something wrong with you when you wasn't hungry. I knew something was very off about you.
That's really profound. I have to think about what we are teaching our children and how we have such limited time while they're young to teach them critical things, and how
Want to do your trick?
What I believe
your trick? Are they ready?
Not focusing on some things and maybe over focusing on some other things. They're all important things. But,
Good babe. Good
we only have so much
babe.
time to
Good job.
that
Good
skill
job.
would just be so great if we could actually
Very good job.
if every kid graduating from middle school or high school had a pretty good
Little
grasp
babe.
on how
Rabbit is little babe.
how coercive people or dominant people will actually socialize you into their web. What a wonderful society that would emerge.
You want more?
I was talking to my other friend Steve Hassan the other week, and he was doing rounds at Harvard Medical School, and a young psychiatrist stood up and said, why don't we have a test for politicians? Why don't we measure them in some way psychologically before? And I sort of said, yes, I've been saying this for so many years, that to get a job in almost any profession, you have to have qualifications, all sorts of things have to have happened to get there. To a politician, you just have to stand up and say, make the Ukraine or East Africa or wherever great again, and people will vote for you. And we should be measuring this, that if people of bad intent, we really shouldn't be making them leaders. We really shouldn't be giving them power. And what we've seen, the corruption that's led to these child abuse scandals, is all to do with that. It's all to do with there being police officers, judges, politicians. I mean, in the UK, a member of Parliament, Cyril Smith, was most definitely involved in the abuse of children in 2 homes, that he was a patron of, that he was an MP, he was a member of Parliament for years. Nobody did anything. So having a different idea that morality is, it is up to me. I have to do something about this. Even if it's just write an anonymous letter about it. I had a case with what a horrible word. I have a very good friend who, she's been on television and talked about it, so there's no confidence involved here. She was sexually abused from the age of 6 when she was in Scientology. When she was 11, one of her friends' mums was actually somebody who understood this kind of thing and took it to the police. And she wrote a full report of what had happened. And a woman called Jan Eastgate, and I'm happy to name her, and she can sue me if she wants, who ran a group called the Citizens Commission on Human Rights, a Scientology front group, Human Rights, went to this girl, 11 years old, and persuaded her to withdraw her evidence and sent her back into the household of the abuser for another 5 years. Now, what bothers me is that the police had a report from an 11-year-old and they decided not to follow it up. No. So we can all take responsibility. We can all do something about it. And, make the world change. But it's not going to happen simply by sitting and listening to me pontificating. We all have to actually do something.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining me, John.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, so I always learn something. I always feel like I should be paying tuition when I talk to you.
Well, I always learn something too, actually, Kirk. You're quite a clever fellow, and you've done some very interesting things. So the feeling's mutual.
And thanks for joining us out there. And everyone, please take care of yourself and take care of other people because we all deserve it. Hello, deserving listeners. So I want to talk about the documentary Wild Wild Country, in which the documentary talks about the Rajneesh commune or cult. We'll get into that debate whether or not it was a commune or cult. And it was in Oregon. But I have a little intro I want to talk about. I love astronomy, and when the eclipse was happening in the United States, it was traversing all the way across the United States last year. A few years ago, I knew about it and planned for it, and I found that the best place to see the eclipse was in Central Oregon because the weather was supposed to be good, and it was going to be, one of the longest eclipses from that location, and it's going to be right in the path. And since Oregon is just south of Seattle, I made my plans and went to the town of Madras, which was right near Antelope. And during the day, I went to this diner because I wanted to, get some food. And there were some locals in there. It was all filled with locals. There's, like 5 or 10 locals. And as I walked in, and other people from other nationalities and other, non-white people were walking in, the locals were looking at all of us with, a very sideways glance. And even one guy was saying like, oh, the stupid eclipse people are here. And I just thought like, man, these small town people, because Madras and Antelope in Central Oregon, these are extremely small towns. We're talking like, I think Antelope back in the 80s had like 50 people, and I'm guessing Madras probably just has like, I don't know, a couple hundred people or something, maybe 1,000, I don't know, but very small town. And I just thought, oh, that's really unfortunate that these people in a small town have this anti, attitude towards outsiders. Incidentally, one of the people who were more vocal as an anti-outsider sort of guy ended up randomly, accidentally sitting next to this Chinese couple who, as an Asian American, I have to say they look very quintessential, very stereotypical. They had cameras and blah, blah, blah. And they struck up a conversation, and the local guy who was this, he looked like a rough and tumble farmer kind of guy. He struck up a conversation with them, and they were talking about cameras, and so he was a nice guy. But anyway, the point is I made note of that. And then I come back home, and I learn about this Netflix documentary. And I'd heard about this story about the Rajneeshs in Oregon before. I can't remember what podcast I was listening to. It might have been This American Life or Radio Lab or something. And I remember hearing about it and thinking it was kind of a weird story. And I thought, well, I don't know, I kind of already know the story. But I sat down to watch the documentary, and I was completely gripped. And I started watching other documentaries about it.
What are you doing?
The documentary on Netflix has a particular
what are you doing over there?
And so I started looking into it. It's just a fascinating story. And I thought back to those locals in that diner in Madras, Oregon, and how anti-outsiders they were. And it all kind of made sense because when you watch this documentary and the history of what outsiders did, the most outsidery outsiders that have ever outsided into rural America just completely, if you know the story, infiltrated and did all sorts of you couldn't, if you wrote a movie plot with this storyline, you'd be like, come on, that's ridiculous. I mean, the twists and turns in the story, legally, violence, terrorism, sexually violence, poisoning, and just how bizarre the whole thing is. The outfits and the police force, the automatic weapons. I mean, it is just a fascinating story. And so I thought, well, I think it makes sense that the guys in the diner were a little skeptical of a whole, because there were thousands of people descending on Madras to see the eclipse, because everyone knew around the world it was the best place to see the eclipse from. And so it all kind of made sense. And I brought on two intelligent people who know everything about cults and a lot of other topics to talk about this documentary and the Rajneeshis in general, to answer the question, was this a cult? What was the deal with these people? What was it like to be in this organization? This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. John, can you introduce yourself? People know you as a regular guest on the podcast, but can you please reintroduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. My name is John Atack, and I'm the director of projects at the Open Minds Foundation, where we seek to provide an education about undue influence and manipulation to help people to avoid becoming involved with dangerous and toxic groups and relationships. On the point of eclipses, just as a sidebar, I highly recommend Annie Dillard's short story Total Eclipse, which is a wonderful description of a total eclipse. So there you go. That's me. And there are, by the way, 7 or 8 things I don't know about. Not quite everything.
Yuval, please introduce yourself back to the listeners.
Hello, I'm Yuval. I've also recorded a few times with you, so someone might be familiar with me. I have a PhD in culture studies that I wrote about the evolution of the capacity for fervor, and I do have a background in evolutionary theory a little bit and some other fields, but I come to cultic studies or cultic, the world of cults from a somewhat different angle than others, yeah, hopefully I'll have something to say about this crazy cult.
So yeah, I wanted to do a podcast about Wild Wild Country, and so I reached out to the two of you because I thought that you would have some awesome things to say about it. Had you seen the podcast or the documentary before I reached out to you?
Yeah, I have. I mean, I saw it when it came out.
Yeah, I hadn't, and you emailed me and you said, well, you probably don't have to watch it because I sadly do know a fair amount about Rajneeshis. And Yuval had actually said, oh, this probably isn't for you, John, because it doesn't answer the questions that I asked, which is, how does somebody become involved? Why do they stay involved? How do they leave? How do they recover? That's what I would like to see in documentaries about so-called cult groups. And it's almost never touched on. You just get what people's experiences were. But I thought, I'll go and watch the first part of it. And just like you, Kurt, I was completely gripped. It is so beautifully produced. I mean, I do have some criticisms, which we'll get to, but it was mesmerising from first to last, I thought, to hear these people's stories. It's a shame that we only heard the stories of the aristocrats of the movement, of the generals. We didn't hear about the slaves. We didn't hear about the grunts and the sort of lives they had. So I think the problem is it may have made it seem attractive to some people. The thing is only attractive if you were right at the top.
Interesting. Yeah, so in case you're not familiar with this group, it's a very twisty, turny story, but in a nutshell, you have this guy in India who is a guru in I believe the 70s, maybe the 60s, early back. We'll just call him Osho. He goes by a number of different names, but Osho is the nickname he goes by. And he has a following in India, and he kind of breaks away from some of the other guru notions in that he embraces capitalism. A lot of the gurus have said you have to give away all your possessions, and this Osho guru is like, had a lot of the similar belief systems as other gurus in India, but also totally embraced capitalism and said, you don't have to give up your possessions. You can actually be wealthy if you want to be, and that's fine. It can't be the focus of your life, but it's okay. And so he has these different followers. People start to flock to him in India. There's some shady business that goes on in India with the law, again, long story short, he ends up looking to leave India and build a commune or a compound in the United States. And him and his people, his organization, decided to have it in Central Oregon because it's so remote. And they figure that the Rajneeshis, the people that follow Osho, can actually dictate their terms if they go to somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And so they go to the middle of nowhere in Central Oregon, and instantly they start to clash with the locals who, have some bigoted attitudes about the Rajneeshis. And it should be said that a lot of the followers were American and educated Americans or educated Westerners.
They were often called the PhD cult.
Yeah, and a lot of them actually were psychologists, interestingly. Like 10% of the organization for the first period of time were psychologists. And there were engineers and computer people and agriculture people and stuff. And but the locals had a lot of suspicion about them. And then there was this clashing between coding, because the commune wanted to build more and more buildings, and so the locals, there were laws and codes in the books that prevented people from.
They'd arrived and said they were there to farm. They hadn't said anything about building a town that would house 10,000 people on the doorstep of this retirement community that, as you said, there were only 40 people in Antelope when Rajneeshis arrived. So they'd gone there for a nice quiet retirement, and they suddenly got these people all over them who were building houses with no permits at all.
Right, and right from the beginning, just a lot of shadiness on behalf of the Rajneesh people. And as the tensions escalated, the locals started taking greater political action, which started to involve not only the city of Antelope, but also the county, and later the state, and later the nation, later the world. It became like a world sensation in the 80s. And the Rajneeshis resorted to a lot of shady activity, particularly the leadership. Just one highlight in terms of the shadiness that they did is they did poison the locals with salmonella by spreading salmonella all over these salad bars as an attempt to prevent them from voting, because a big vote was coming up. And also just kind of like a revenge, just trying to get back at the people in some ways. And that's just one of the things that these, peace-loving New Agey Rajneeshis did. They also involved themselves in media a lot. They were very hostile, and they started to arm themselves, and it was just a very sensational thing. And then eventually it culminated in Osho being deported by the federal government, I believe, and then things kind of fell apart from there. So that doesn't give the story justice. It's a very interesting story that I recommend. There's even YouTube 20-minute documentaries that are fascinating, because a big part of it is you have to see the visuals of this commune and the people and the things that they do, which was very similar to other New Age communes of the time. Lots of encounter groups kind of things where people are screaming, their emotions, primal screaming. The 70s and the 60s, and I guess the 80s, there was a practice in humanistic psychology, that's a very small subset, where people would get together and scream. And also they had a very liberal sexual policy, and were termed as a sex cult by society. But anyway, so that's it in a nutshell. But I want to know from the two of you, John and Yuval, what did you, let me ask you this first question, because I'm sure the listeners are curious. Was this group a cult, and by what definition do we look to define whether or not something's a cult or not?
Well, I think we can maybe just move the word aside. By dictionary definition, a cult is a group that follows a leader or a doctrine. That's it. It came during the 60s and 70s to have a pejorative, negative meaning. So when I started with this work, we were very careful to talk about destructive or dangerous cults.
The loading was in the adjective, not in the noun. Now academics are arguing that we shouldn't use the word cult and we should call them new religious movements. Now, that's new in the sense of something that happened since 1830, when the Latter-day Saints were formed, who are apparently the first new religious movement. So anything since 1830 is new. Religious in the sense that they believe something, because groups like Est and the Sullivannians, therapy cults, commercial cults, are all lumped in. They become religious too, according to this sociological definition, and movements. And of course, things like the Manson family get thrown in, and you could hardly call them a movement.
The sannyasins, they fit every definition of cult. Also, the destructive cults, they fit I think that you'll be hard pressed to find the definition of cult that they will not fit into, because even the ones that are very pejorative and that assume that they're horrible, because they were a horrible cult.
So, John, are you saying that the original definition of cults was more open to lots of different kinds of organizations, but then
it's about the devotion to the leader?
Because I've heard people have definitions of cults that I'm guessing, according to you, you would call destructive cults.
Yeah, well, we differentiated. Johnny West brought forward a definition of a totalist cult. I have in front of me the Oxford English Dictionary, because I always keep one on my knee just in case. And it says cult, which is a substantive noun, which means worship since 1683.
I don't know if he was just kidding.
A particular form of religious worship, especially in reference to external rites and ceremonies, 1671.
Scientology.
It doesn't transfer to devotion to a particular person or thing. And that's been the definition since 1711. They had nothing here about it being nasty or horrible. Those are inferences that have been drawn by groups who've been called cults, and by academics who are trying not to tread on their toes. Those same academics will call somebody like me an apostate, so they don't mind insulting, those of us who left a group. But they're very cautious about the feelings of people who are involved in these groups, and that's understandable. We don't want to upset anybody. But
well, John, are there examples of cults, according to that definition, that are not destructive? And
well, there's cult movies. There's people who really love the Rocky Horror Picture Show. They love cult. That's cult movie, right?
Yeah, and there are, of course, any religious or political group that communists are the cult of Marx, without making any statement about.
Or Mao or Lenin sometimes.
Well, I'd rather not bring them into it, because with Mao and Lenin, you can say those are destructive cults, no doubt. With Karl Marx, some of what he's saying, like equality for women, for example, they're very good ideas. Since I'm not a Marxist. I am not now, nor have I ever been. I'm in this one. But there are, by that definition, somebody who really likes soccer can be in the cult of Nottingham Forest, my local team. And they do have 3 or 4 cult members. It's anything that people become enthusiastic about and caught up in.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm a part of probably 55 cults according to that definition.
Yeah, at least.
Yeah, Star Wars, Huskies, Seahawks.
I don't want to know this. This is just too much information.
What's the definition of a destructive cult?
Well, here I am. I mentioned Johnny West. I've been told off for mentioning my friendship with him before, because people say he was involved in all sorts of conspiracies with the CIA and things, but certainly not a side of him that I knew. But anyway,
Singer's definition of it.
I've got Jolly's. Well, that's it. I've got a group or movement exhibiting a great or excessive devotion or dedication to some person, idea, or thing, and employing unethical, manipulative, or coercive techniques of persuasion and control designed to advance the goals of the group's leaders to the possible or actual detriment of members, their families, or the community. Pretty good, eh?
Yeah.
So let's answer the question that way. Whether Rajneesh is a totalist cult, yes. It was a long way to get to, but the answer is yes.
So what harm? I mean, I can answer that question too, but you're better at answering these questions. What harm did they do to its members and the community?
Well, the reason that they were thrown out of Pune, and I'm a little critical of Wild Country here, they show you just one clip from a documentary that was filmed at Pune in India when they were still there. Now, they had these techniques of liberation where you would be basically put in a room, told to take your clothes off, and have sex with the people in the room. Now, that, as a therapist, you probably know that can be quite dangerous for people psychologically. But they also have an exercise where they fill a room with people and tell them to hit each other. And it is said that the reason that I've been told the reason they were thrown out of Pune was because the local hospital was reporting them to the government authorities, saying we're getting all of these people with broken bones. So it's a very direct and immediate harm that occurred.
Also financial harm, of course.
Yeah, people would, oddly enough, give all their money. And his Osho is well known for the count of Rolls Royces he had.
100, according to some reports, 100 Rolls Royces.
Yeah, I've seen 86, and 92, and the problem was that whenever he drove one of them, he would crash it because his eyesight, because he was living in a different spiritual world to us, his eyesight was not really good in this universe.
He might have been on some drugs as well.
He was on some drugs, and
He was.
I read a 300-page book about Rajneesh. He's written by his bodyguard. Very good book. But he could have told me on the first page, he buried the lead. He gets to the very end of the book, he's his bodyguard. He's looking every day.
What's the name of the book?
I don't remember offhand. Now shamed me in front of an audience of millions. Actually, that's one of the 7 or 8 things I don't know about cults. He basically had thrown them into this situation where they were harming and damaging each other, yes. But at the end of the book, this guy says, and he was taking 50 milligrams of diazepam, Valium, a day, which is a massive dose of Valium. It's given out in 2 and 5 milligram doses.
Yeah, 50, that's a lot.
Yeah, 1 or 2 hits of nitrous oxide. That is kind of confirmed sideways, but they don't explain it in Wild Country. When Marilyn Sheila, who ran all of the dirty operations and went to prison for 3.5 years for it, she says, we were trying to get his doctor out of the way, and they in fact tried to kill the doctor. And there's a trial about that later where she's called Ma Shanti B. She actually injected him with something in the attempt to kill him. Because Manan Sheila says he was giving drugs to the Bhagwan. So, yeah, this was a guy who was high. And when you look at him wandering out, going namaste to people with his big brown eyes, floating in pools of diazepam, it's sort of, he's blissed out, and he's blissed out because he is tranked out of his head.
Yeah, I took 10 milligrams of diazepam for a party once. No, just joking. For a surgery on my mouth.
Yeah.
And there was nothing that could possibly bother me. I'm terrified of drills and surgery while I'm awake, and they had to drill into my jaw with a drill, like an actual, the kind of drill you would, it's a medical drill, but it looks like a drill you would use to like hang a picture on your wall.
It's like a road drill.
Yeah, and repeatedly drilling into my jaw because each drill bit had to be progressively bigger and bigger.
Let's get through to the drugs. This is starting to, we're all getting toothache.
Right, and I'm completely wide awake, but I'm on 10 milligrams of Valium, and no problem. Like, total chill. This was like an hour-long procedure, and I was so chill. I was like, not a problem, dude. Not a problem.
Multiply that by 5, but then you add nitrous oxide. Now, nitrous oxide is, Ron Hubbard began his career with a hit of nitrous oxide, where he reckoned he died for 8 minutes during a dental operation. I must say, he didn't go into quite as much graphic detail about the operation as you did, but that was the beginning of Scientology. He would say, in February 1938, he had his wisdom tooth extracted. Nitrous oxide, William James has a chapter in Varieties of Religious Experience, a wonderful chapter about the nitrous oxide clubs of the late 19th century, where these intellectuals would go and take laughing gas and just trip out, the intense hallucinations, spiritual visions, all sorts of things going on. So it's interesting, it's just one of those other little strange little connections between the totalist cult gurus.
Interesting. So they harmed the community, obviously, because they poisoned the community on several occasions and threatened the community and tried to take over the politics of the community, try to run them out of town.
And busted about 3,000 homeless people.
Right.
And then just dumped them on the street at gunpoint. Out of here.
And drugged them while they were at the
Okay, they drugged anybody that was a problem. They were drugged with haloperidol, which is
haloperidol.
Yeah,
which is not a nice thing to do.
So Sheila is a prominent figure. If you don't know the story, she was the Osho's right-hand woman, and was
when she was 16.
Yeah, and a dedicated person, and she was the figurehead and the primary speaker for.
Yeah, he stopped speaking for 3 years, so she did it all for him.
Right, he stopped speaking even to the commune people.
Yeah, he probably was still speaking to Mara and Sheila, but I think he was going, no, I think I'll just take some more Valium and another hit. The guys keep on with it. I'm going to drive one of my Rolls Royces into a wall.
Yeah.
And that was the life he lived.
It just seems so boring, honestly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We call them that these kind of narcissistic people who they're wholly, and you know a lot more about this than I do. But from your study of narcissistic personality disorder and having treated people who have this thing, but they have no self. They Freud reckoned that it's because they don't love anyone but themselves, but they don't love themselves. But so to exist, they have to have adulation from the outside, and then they just sit back into that. And Hubbard became hyperactive and never stopped. And then, well, he did stop. Actually, have collapses of weeks on end. But he was really pushing things. Osho seems to have just withdrawn and become disinterested. I'd also like to say his background is very interesting. He had a master's degree in philosophy, which was awarded with distinction. That gave him very briefly a professorship in philosophy. So he has an interesting psychological background. He's piecing together the flotsam and jetsam of Hinduism and Buddhism and Christianity into something that, as you say, was convincing to the 10% of his followers who were psychologists.
Right. It makes you wonder.
Got quite a spiel going on.
Yeah, it made me wonder, based on his background. He is an educated man. He's in academia, and then he starts to, he creates this thing, and there was a lot of that happening at the time in the 60s and 70s. There were a lot of Westerners, running to
the Beatles.
Yeah, the Beatles, and famously, and others running to India.
But it happened at that point when the Beatles, the Zen and Hinduism and Buddhism things have been coming in since the 50s through people like Alan Watts and Aldous Huxley. But it slams mainstream when the Beatles meet Sexy Sadie.
Right.
And called the Maharishi, the great teacher.
Yeah, and it
physics, by the way.
Yeah, you wonder about Osho's motivations. Was it true, or was he knowingly manipulating people? You know,
I'd just like to say to anybody listening who is still a follower of Rajneesh, that Rajneesh said categorically, with a living master, everything works. With a dead master, nothing works. So that's my one line, quit now, according to the teacher himself. I think Rajneesh Hubbard strikes me as both crank and charlatan. He was somebody who, on Wednesdays, believed everything he'd said, and on Thursdays knew he was a fraud. And his whole time, I've said so many reports from so many people about that. I think Rajneesh knew he was a charlatan from the beginning. That's the feeling I get from him. But then you see, say, Prem Narayan, the lawyer, who still today is, when he starts talking about him, he tears up and he can't speak. He feels such love, such devotion to this man who didn't speak to anybody for 3 years and just nodded his head.
But wrote a number of books, or sometimes other people wrote the books for him. You can read a lot.
He produced a lot. There was a lot of literature coming out of that. Whether it's like Hubbard, that he just sat around and talked and other people wrote it down and made it into books. Because I think there are 28 Scientology books that were published before I left. And 27 of those weren't written by Hubbard. I later talked to the people who wrote some. But they're all from Hubbard's conversation, or in the early days from his lectures, public lectures. By the 70s, they'd taken to having a tape recorder on all the time. He was, well, whether he was awake or asleep, you know, there'd be a tape recorder in the room. So I met a guy in 1993 who his job had been to go through these thousands and thousands of hours of tapes and find anything that could be, you know, put into a little issue to send out. And he said it was an impossible task. You know, and he started on it really because they just assigned one guy to it, you know, transcribe all of this.
Yeah, during my dissertation, I did a qualitative study in which I interviewed people for about an hour, maybe an hour and a half, and I only conducted 10 of those interviews, and I had to transcribe them and go over them. That's just, 10 or 15 hours of audio, and it was so much work, so I can't imagine going over hundreds of thousands of hours. I just want to say from the onset that I have sympathy for the people who, enjoyed themselves or appreciated being in this commune or cult or whatever we want to call it. Even Scientology, for example, low-level, entry-level Scientology activity can be quite meaningful. It can also be quite destructive.
It's unfortunate that from the get-go, they're using guided imagination techniques, which can cause quite severe shifts in people. I have a friend who was involved for 11 months, and I knew him when he was in, and he came back to me about 7 years ago. So I hadn't seen him for 30-something years. And he then told me that he'd done a drill that he's done in the first course, what used to be always the first course, but then the communication course.
Call from. To accept, press 1. To send a.
Hey.
Okay. I was worried about you. Don't fall asleep.
No, I'm fine. I'm fine.
How was it? It took a little while, huh?
Fucking sucks.
Yeah.
It sucks when you don't know. When I left, I didn't know where I was going either. I got lost again.
Wait, when you left, when you drove leaving?
Yeah.
Your GPS doesn't work at all?
Well, I took a left.
See.
Should I go 3A or 495?
490.
495 towards Lawrence. Well, I'll know in a minute.
You go, it says like to Boston.
Yeah. 3A is on one side, and then it's like 495 Lawrence. It says 3A to Boston.
Yeah, I think.
But they're both in the same. I don't know. I'll know in a minute. Hopefully, I'm not going in the wrong direction.
You take a right. I can try and look it up. Let me look. So where did you get lost?
Next to exit 37.
Well,
and then says Billerica.
yeah, you would have gone past Billerica going there, so.
I would have gone past it? Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
Okay, so I see it, 93, 6 miles.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, so it makes sense. You'll get on 93.
93 south, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. How's your patient?
He is very well. Except his poops, I don't know. He might have. There seems to be some sticky, no diarrhea, but possibly some stickier than usual poop situation. But I'm just letting them.
No flakes?
Flakes?
Yeah, the lead paint chips. You'll shit them out.
Oh, I haven't inspected totally for flakes.
Yeah, those, he's gonna poop them out. If you ate them, he's gonna poop them out. He can't, dissolve those. He can't digest them. He's just catch enough of it to have a tummy ache, but.
God, I can't see anything. Oh my God. My body is so tired. Yeah, I'm gonna wait till you come back to vacuum the poops. I'm just letting them, and you can inspect them for flakes and stuff. He's in his corner now. He had some mint. He did a spin. He's very. Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay. He seems very much himself again. That was what was really great. When he didn't want that basil, I was like, oh my God. what is wrong with him, because you've seen that the Java rabbit, like Java rabbit, there is no time of day, nowhere, no location is Java the rabbit going to be like, oh no, I don't need that herb. I won't accept a treat. You know, I mean, you're talking about a man that stuck his whole head, like licked clean a Thai soup container for the herbages. But he has since eaten all the herbs, and I'm drinking his Pedialyte watered down with lime, and I feel like it's giving me a lot of strength.
Yeah, well.
But I'm like waiting for you. I haven't put stuff in the car because I want to figure out how we should do it.
All right.
But I've got everything in bags and stuff. I mean, it's pretty okay. I mean, anything we're going to leave here, we can just leave here, right?
Right.
I just don't know.
Yeah, we'll bag out the trash, you know?
We just might have to do like 2 trips. Maybe.
All right.
It's very quiet on wherever you are.
Where?
I don't know, on the line.
Well, I'm just at the Boston exit now, 40A for 93 south.
I'm so cold. I think Henny was just like moving around. I got kind of scared. I was like, who's here? I'm really like scaring myself recently with all my Jeffrey Epstein stuff, which, oh my God, I want to watch the Jeffrey Epstein documentary so bad, but I can't let myself do it.
Yeah.
I think we're in pretty good shape. It's like, I don't know all these shit over here, you know, some stuff I just don't know. Like, because it's like there's stuff, but some of the stuff I'm not going to take. And I don't know some of the stuff of what you want to take or what you don't want to take. I think we need to take, you know, like all the nutcrackers and stuff. And then just the ceiling, the whole like decoration, installation stuff. Like I want to do that last.
Got it.
Because I'd like to spray the flat. It's like, I don't think that's going to take me that long at all. But I'd rather do that like the last thing.
Right.
And like these drawers. I don't know, maybe. I don't know. We'll just see how much. I mean, I think all the stuff we can fit in the car really is just going to be like furniture. That's going to be that we'll just have to come back for.
Yeah.
And I don't feel like that's going to be a problem. But that's like, it's like, you know.
No, I don't think it's going to be a problem.
I don't get those, but then it's like Mel, like, has those anxiety. I'm like, I hate that because I'm like, I don't, when it's like you say, you're acting one way, but like, Lori and Ben aren't acting like that, you know? I would tell if they were like, I don't know. I'm not worried about it.
No, not at all.
And I just hate like moving shit around and putting everything in bags all together last minute, and then I have to go and reorganize all my shit again. So I think I've done pretty okay.
All right.
You don't sound like you're driving. You sound like you're like in a, like, there's no sound on the phone. I feel like that's where, are your windows closed?
Yeah.
Was anybody in the building?
I heard people.
Did my studio look any different?
The studio kind of looks a little bit like a hurricane went through it. There's a bunch of like things on the ground that I think maybe were blown down.
What? Is the window open?
It was only open a little bit, but the door was locked.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I wonder if Cunha's been there, because Samantha, I guess, moved into the live workspaces, so Cunha must be. So I don't think he was even going over there, but I know that he's going over to Lowell now, so I wonder. So how did you get over?
I found a wooden pole and used it to pop the lock.
Oh. Interesting. I've never done that one.
Yeah, I mean, I looked at the situation and I decided it just looked like I was going to be able to jump down there.
Oh, yeah. Have you seen me go over it?
Yeah, I have. I wouldn't tell anyone to do that.
Yeah. No, I don't. Somebody, I think Kirk wanted to do it. I'm like, no, you have to it's really treacherous. It was kind of scary the first time. It's like, but.
Yeah.
Because you have to get your foot, like, right. The only place to put your foot is on the handle of the door on the inside. So if you're not an acrobat, it's easy to, like, and then you're going to fall hard, like, and if you have a Dunalingus or whatever, you could hit that right on the knob. Uh-oh.
Yeah, I know.
Uh-oh. Little babe is... Okay, he's okay. He's very stretched out, but I think he's okay.
My life's okay.
Where is the broom?
There's one right out in the hallway, I thought.
Oh, it's outside? I've listened to so much of this. Oh, this is the shitty broom, though. Where's the good broom?
I don't know.
I'm so cold. There's like no hoodies in here. No hoodies. I'm cold.
I know.
I'm cold. I'm cold. Oh my God, what time is it? What? Wait, what time is it? Okay, 2:36. That's not that bad. I thought it was like 3:38.
Yeah.
Why is there no hoodies up in here? Why is there no hoodies up in here?
I can't hear what you're saying.
Why ain't there no hoodies? Why ain't there no hoodies?
Well, I'm wearing one.
I know you took it. Wait, I have something. Oh. Oh. How many trips did it take you?
Two.
Oh, that's not bad. So you just got lost for leaving?
Getting there.
And leaving.
Yeah.
Dang. You could have called me. I wonder why your GPS is really that bad. You gotta get a different phone. My phone sucks.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened to mine. Like, what the fuck? Like, I went in, I got it off the charger, brought it to the radio, never used it, and I've never seen it again. Like, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
But whatever, it doesn't even matter. It's not like I even had anything great on it. I don't think. Like, I don't even care. But whatever.
I'm gonna let you go. I'm driving to construction, so
Okay.
I'll see you very soon.
Okay. Be safe.
Love you. Will do.
Oh, here's the broom. Now I see a good broom. Right after I use the one. Soy de Mexico, a la Mexico. Oh, my bra is starting to hurt me. Okay. I've been really dedicated to these cult programs for the last 4 hours. But this one, I think I tried to watch this documentary that they're talking about even, but I couldn't really get into it, and I'm not really totally understanding it now. What's going on?
early drill, it's called bull baiting. And you've basically learned to sit and stare at somebody without moving.
No, too hot.
To confront somebody that they really don't like to say stare, they like to say confront. You've then sat with your eyes closed in front of somebody, then you sat and stared at them. And now the third drill in. So this could be within 2 hours of starting something. You do this thing where you're not meant to react no matter what's said to you, called bull baiting. People will be very rude, they'll be obscene, they'll be comic, they'll do whatever they can to get a reaction. And they don't have to repeat what gave you a reaction until you can just sit there stony-faced. And this is meant to help you later as a communicator and as a counselor. Now, that drill did something to him that lasted for 30 years. So I would have a certain caution about the application of any hypnotic technique, any form of guided imagination.
What happened to him? What happened to him?
Yeah.
Oh, what happened to him was that he'd come to the group because he felt anxious. He used to feel anxiety more than his usual. He was about 20 years old. And during a single session of bull bait, he felt this anxiety go away from him. This wonderful, wonderful sense that the thing he'd come for, he'd now achieved. The problem was, weeks later, his emotions were none of them functioning properly. That he realized that he just wasn't connecting emotionally anymore. He wasn't feeling things. He'd somehow thrown a switch inside himself that to stop the occasional sense of panic that he had just switched off his responses. And as I say, that went on for decades. And he did all sorts of things to try and deal with it.
That's awful.
I'm happy to say that he dealt with it. We talked a little bit, but he somehow sorted it out. I hope I was helpful in that process. But so very early things can have a tremendous effect. Also, of course, if you've got a huge amount of money, and I've had a guy who signed a $1 billion contract 9 days after meeting, and he would have been in virtual slavery from the day he joined on with Facebook with literally hundreds of people who were a 90-hour week at $5 a week, not allowed to see their children, bullied and bossed around, and just awful. There's a point. One little anecdote. There was a point where Ron Hubbard was running his film cruise. He did some little internal films in La Quinta, in the West Coast of the US. And it was pretty horrifying. Temperatures around 100 degrees most of the time. And they're filming and doing these things. And he decided at one point that the crew were spending too much money. Too much money was being spent on them. So he took away their allocation of toilet paper. And you get these stories from people who are there about them, having to go further and further to phone boxes and cafes so they could steal the phone directories, because they weren't allowed to have toilet paper. And you've entered a crazy world. Now, the idea that the little tune that the Pied Piper plays to the beginning, might have some use in it. The interesting thing is that people will take from what they get. In talking with members directly, which is something I do only every now and then, but it was my daily life for many years, they'll come out with all sorts of statements about benefit. And my answer to that is, great, it's necessary, you should. But you should also realise that it wasn't the technique they gave you alone that did this. It was you. You would have, I know, Kirk, when you talk about therapy, you talk about basically helping people to help themselves. And you're proud of what they achieved. You don't come away going, oh, wow, I'm absolutely brilliant at what I did.
No, I create a cult. I create a cult where people worship me and they have to give me Rolls Royces to attribute all the benefits to me. No, yeah, you're right.
We're working on it. You probably need to grow the beard a little bit longer.
Yeah.
And work on the new Delhi accent.
Yeah.
Whatever benefit you get. If you talk about the concept of resilience in survivors of, people who don't get post-traumatic stress disorder despite horrific things, you can learn resilience. by being in the cult group.
Right. So these groups, from what I can gather about their process, they use techniques that are well known to either actually be beneficial or create a pseudo, spiritual experience, and from those experiences, the people in control will connect a larger control schema to those experiences. And the members don't realize that, as you're saying, that you can get those experiences in a wide variety of contexts. It's just...
Let me shoehorn Yuval into the conversation here. He's a particular expert of it, which is that what you'll be given is a technique that makes you feel better. And there are even many therapists who believe that that's a good thing, something that makes you feel better. I like to point out cocaine, heroin, and alcohol all make people feel better. Does it have a long-term benefit getting high? And the point is, if you get somebody stare at something for long enough in meditation or whatever, they will get the Ganzfeld effect. The brain will start creating chatter and noise, and they'll hallucinate. If you put somebody in a dark room for 10 minutes, or a coffin, which is happening in South Korean businesses at the moment, our lunch break was in a coffin. I had a fantastic experience. If you put somebody in the dark for 10 minutes, they'll start moving. They'll start with this positive experience, and then you can pick it up.
Yeah, well, so first of all, it's not only beneficial thing sometimes. And
being put in a coffin is not a beneficial thing. But it can, you can have powerful responses.
Yes, but in cults, many times you see bad experiences interpreted as good things that happen. So if we take a look at the dynamic meditation that was, and I think in some version of it still, done by followers of Osho, do you guys know how this works? You start with 10 minutes of overbreathing.
Yeah, hyperventilation, the Gross method, which will break you out to start with. Yeah, they showed us it. They showed us in World War Country.
Yeah, but they don't explain it.
Yeah, but I'm saying they do show it, so you can actually, we've spoiled everything in this, but it's worth seeing just to see people doing the hyperventilation.
But so let me explain what happens when you do this. So in general, your blood acidity is pulled in two directions. The lungs pull it towards the blood being more basic, and the kidneys pull it towards being more acidic. And when you overbreathe, like they do, you just breathe too fast, too rapidly, and consistently, the kidneys cannot catch up, cannot keep up with the lungs. And so what happens, the blood becomes basic and people experience a panic attack.
Now, so they need a lot of diazepam. Is this where we're going? I did this, and every day I had to take 50 milligrams.
The panic attack, the fingers and tingling and pains, and it's very, very not pleasant, but it is presented as traumas leaving your body. So it's a great thing that it happened.
It's good that you really hurt.
Because now you're so much more advanced. And so people, so you start with the 10 minutes, and then there's 10 minutes of screaming, and you see people really screaming all sorts of stuff.
Throwing their arms around.
Yeah, ripping, lying on the floor and contorting. And partially that is because of the induced panic attack. After 10 minutes of that, they do jump.
I gotta hear about this.
Jumping and over breathing. So that in this phase, they say the word who again and again and again, and you're jumping. Yeah. So it's that kind of over breathing in that form. And while they're doing it, they're also jumping, and that is very, very exhausting. So this is, and of course, this is all in a large group setting. So this the crowd and the group should not be underestimated as something that you can't do this alone, and it would not be the same. Or you could do it alone, but with a group, it's different. So after 10 minutes of this jumping and over breathing, they are silent completely. It's pretty, it's a strange, eerie feeling for 10 minutes, and then they go back to dancing. So this is a very, very strong emotional experience that is induced in people. They interpret it as a good thing, but I don't think that that you can call it, beneficial on its own. I think that kind of experience can be beneficial if it is manipulated towards getting you to improve yourself, because it is very, very impactful. But if
I take benefit to be what the person takes from it. And as a Sufi say, most of what I know comes from suffering. So most of what I've learned comes the benefit I've drawn. So it's what in Scientology you have this bizarre phrase occasionally used, negative gain, which is a benefit that comes from something, the horrible that's happened to you. So for me, I'm making a particular point that if I'm talking to somebody who's experienced a group, there are people who say, well, it was all bad, it was all horrible, you wasted your life. But that's absolutely untrue. The camaraderie that people feel in prisons, in military units, that camaraderie is worth something. And with Scientologists, many of them come away and they go, I felt good.
And also we have to remember that sometimes you have a very, very bad experience that is actually a good memory. So, yeah. So just because they remember it as good, it might not have been quite as good as they remember it. But when this kind of manipulation is used to get you to, quote, stroke the ego, whatever that is, or work for 90 hours a week for no pay, be very paranoid about the nuclear war that's supposed to happen, and they're going to build an underground thing, the sannyasins, and that's
but Mardan Sheila did build an underground thing, and below it's another one from when she tape recorded everything that happened to 15,000 people. Unbelievable. Every phone that's happened.
So what I'm saying is that sometimes even good experiences can be manipulated into a bad effect on people, but sometimes bad experiences are interpreted as good experiences and are also can be manipulate people either or negatively or sometimes positively if it is done in an ethical, therapeutic context. But this was not.
No, and the technique they're using, I doubt, could ever be used for therapeutic context because it's inherently dangerous. I'm going to rant about mindfulness at some point along the way because I'm just horrified. I've had one person after another, medical professionals, really qualified people, recommending to my kids that they do mindfulness. And when I say, do you know what that is? They say, oh yeah, they're these relaxing techniques. And I go, you know where they came from? They're Buddhist. You go, yeah, do you know which sects they come from and how we got them? And do you know what their teachers would tell you about the dangers of what you're doing? Because you're now telling somebody to use a technique which very readily induces an altered state of mind. And you're telling them to go home and do it on their own. Statistically, and the statistics have been with us for decades, something like 40% of people, if they sit down and stare at something without having any exercise first, they have what's called comically known as relaxation-induced anxiety. 40%. A large amount of people, if you just sit them down and say, stare at the wall, they'll they'll feel anxious. Now, that's not very helpful. You know, what's more, there are much easier ways of relaxing than, following some little handoff of Vipassana Buddhism or Soto Zen Buddhism. That, are techniques that, if they are to be effective, and I'm highly dubious of, what I know of Tibetan and Zen monasteries, I'm afraid. Sorry, so I'm being very unpopular today. That's mindfulness I'm taking a shot at now. I'm not going to say anything unpleasant. No, I'm not even good. But it's exactly what transcendental meditation was in the 60s and 70s. That practices which come from religious groups are being secularized. It's happened with yoga, but with yoga, the asanas and the prana yoga, the bodily movement and the breathing yoga, they're probably okay. It's only when you get into Raja Yoga that you start thinking, what does this word yoga mean? Other things are saying the word yoke. Y-O-K-E. It's what you put on oxen to plow. It's something that yokes you to God. That's what the word yoga means. Now, you can take something useful from that, look back hot yoga, that sounds a bit silly, but there are useful things, and you get this mixing up of what is that usefulness? I think Tai Chi Chuan is a wonderful practice. I learned how to do it, spent 6 months doing it, then lost it along the way later. But it was very calming. But I was also very aware that it was inducing a particular state of mind in me.
So what was your criticism of the documentary? I'm curious.
Me or John?
Both of you.
No, you've asked speak.
Yeah, so I
No, you don't say yes after I say that. You sorry.
Well, I was very critical of much more than you two, because I was. It's my fault. It's maybe not the documentary's fault, but I was expecting something, a little bit about what it's like to. How many hours a day or a week do these people work? None of that. What it's like to be.
The answer is 7 days a week.
There you go. And which was presented as work, presented as meditation or worship or as play.
Building houses as meditation.
Yeah. So you see this huge construction, and you don't give us 5 seconds of saying the people who built it worked for no labor, for all their time, and it was.
But we gave them a decent burial.
So I was throughout the documentary. I was waiting for a little bit of what it's like to be one of them. What it's like to. What were the punishments if you did something wrong? What happens to people who are, all sorts of the daily life as a sannyasin. How do people join? The 4 questions that John mentioned earlier. And so throughout the documentary, I'm continuously frustrated that I get none of that. And they literally could have given me, 2 minutes, 120 seconds of someone describing a day in the life of a sannyasin, how many hours of work, what the dynamic meditation is like. Just a little bit, and I would have had a much better experience.
Oh, it's true. We only saw the aristocracy.
Yeah, completely the aristocracy, and it made it look like a good thing. It made it look like,
which is why they complain that some people might be attracted to it by watching this thing, which is why I say again, with a living master, everything works. With a dead master, nothing works. He's dead, guys.
Why do you think the documentary people depicted it that way?
So it could be out of laziness. It could be out of not wanting to. And so they wanted the people who participated in the documentary to like the documentary, and I think that if they would have been openly critical of it, if they would have talked about people who committed suicide, because I know someone whose sister joined the Osho and then committed suicide, and she's hates them, she's very devastated by it. But I think that all those people who are still today are, as John mentioned, the lawyer, I think that if they would have seen this documentary and it would have been critical of the cult, they would have been they would have felt that they were taking advantage of. Maybe they only participated because they were given assurances that they would, I don't know. There could be many reasons, but it could be just out of, lack of curiosity.
What I think it was they were trying to make a compelling narrative of two sides of the same coin. I think if they included all that stuff, the documentary would have been decidedly, the audience would have been decidedly anti-Rajneesh, right?
Which I think is the way the audience should be. So.
Right, but the documentary, and which is common to popular documentaries of today, they try to present a story that bounces you back and forth in terms of your sympathies, because it makes it more interesting that way. If it's just a documentary, like making a documentary about Hitler or something, you're not going to be like, oh, I have sympathy for Hitler or anything. But
was a vegetarian.
Yeah.
Well, the news is your channel as well. The news is all about false equivalency, and we're going to give you both sides, and then
Yeah.
Even when there are no two sides.
First animal rights laws, Hitler.
Yeah.
First politician to observe tobacco smoking. But they didn't show conflict.
I don't
they didn't show
understand.
tension, which is what we normally do respond to dramas and documentaries. They squeezed into this place. It was interesting. You used the word bigoted when you talked about the residents of Antelope.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, when I got to my dad, where I took the coat out of the trunk.
As I came to know those people and realised what they were talking about, they were presented as rednecks.
Right.
You started getting these rich stories out of them, and then started getting this, we did everything we could. And then these people spent 4 years. You get to the point where the town you live, town council, you've got one member left. Right? They've got like 9 people on the town council. So they decided to have a police force patrolling 24 hours a day with assault weapons, dressed up in stupid pretend military uniform, like with pink patches on or whatever. And they're standing around outside your door, and one of the residents was saying, at night they'd be driving up and down the street with the lights, with wigwags going, and sirens
back here.
So, isn't it interesting?
What the hell?
Reflecting on it, the use of the word bigoted.
The usage of that word, I was referring to the initial reaction that was depicted in the documentary. Prior to all of
and that's exactly why it's the right word to use, because that's
what he's doing. It's not how lining her up.
It's a documentary show.
Yeah, he can't.
So I felt there was a slant.
What is his psychology with this?
It was like he was an ex-member who was going, oh, this is a great time of my life, and I want to remember this way. So it's like a beautiful movie with sunsets that should be apocalypse now. The tension that actually existed. Yes, the suicide rate was high. The same with Scientology. When I checked, it was running 3, 4, 5, 6 times higher, 100,000 than it's normal. By boasting far many more members than they've ever had, they make it look insignificant. But the amount of killers who have come out of such groups, people like Charles Manson, 150 out of the Scientology, which he said gave him the confidence to become a leader.
Right. So I want to close with one question. Why would, well, I guess 2 questions. Why would people join such a thing and stay in the Rajneesh cult? And 2, why would the leaders do what they did?
Well, the first question,
everything seems so bizarre,
It is. Yuval is exactly the man to answer the question about how did the change in the person come about that they became committed, and with Prem Niran still a highly intelligent trial attorney, successful before he joined them, highly intelligent, and seemingly a charming man, and you'd like to sit and talk to him. But he's still totally buzzed out on the idea that this man who he called Bhagwan, I used that word with a Hindu friend a few years ago, and I got such a look of shock. She said, Bhagwan? Well, she didn't say it actually, her face said it. How dare I say Supreme God? And what a thing to call you, speaking of narcissistic personality. Yeah. But how people become involved, Yuval knows it also.
So, well, it's there's a number of techniques. For example, as I mentioned, the dynamic meditation, which was done every day, and also the effect of the crowd that makes you hot. That can make you have a very, very strong life-changing experience, and that
you feel awe in Yuval's.
You feel, yeah, or one of the emotions connected. Wonder, sublime, mystery,
sublimity,
and the experience is the experience of the really real. It's not the ordinary real, and you feel people profoundly real. Yeah, people feel that they saw things as they really are, and from now on,
the colours in the room are brighter. The colours in the room are brighter. That's an actual Scientology one, and one known to all hypnotists. The sudden heightening of awareness. Wow, I'm in reality at last. It's like in The Wizard of Oz, where it goes from black and white to colour. You can have that experience, and that is a benefit. The problem is where it goes.
In my research and in my book that I'm writing right now, I connect this kind of experience, the sudden conversion experience. And there's also slow conversion. So I'm not saying that this is necessary, but this experience, I think, is related psychologically to the experience of becoming a parent, which is an experience that can makes you feel that this person knows everything. He knows about reality. And then he gives you a text like that. It's hard to make, to feel that that is true. And so this is yet another in a long list of manipulative techniques. And of course, the having sex with strangers can also, which from my understanding, and many times within the cult, especially in India, you were not allowed to refuse sex with anybody else. And
I believe that was still the case in Oregon, according to one of the statements in World War countries.
Yes.
And they had pictures of themselves taken naked, dancing around, having orgies.
But also they say that in Oregon, they were way too exhausted from construction and overwork and lack of sleep to have too much sex.
Well, see how few babies were born in that community. That's a bit weird. But then Rajneesh said, we will be the world's first AIDS-free community. And he issued not only condoms, but rubber gloves.
And from what I heard, that they would, you could be punished by giving you AIDS, which at the time was of course very lethal. So that's not.
Sorry,
so when you say why do people join, I think that many times people are that they're given. So when you have this kind of experience, right, you see a miracle or something like that, you have a very strong experience, and that experience can prove almost anything, because the experience does not need to be connected to what is included.
An inexplicable event, you said.
Yes, so you see a miracle and you come to conclusions that are not related to the miracle.
But it's not necessarily a miracle. It's something
what you consider to be a miracle.
You can see a Yuri Geller or some couple doing something, or you with a couple of rubber bands around your finger. You can see that thing, and you can't explain it. And it's rather like Milton Erickson's moment of confusion. That hypnosis is something that slips in at the moment when you can't quite make sense of things.
So, when you go to an ashram, like an Osho meditation retreat that they still have today, and the person who will be
There's a ball in it to prevent water from going through the motor.
It's hard for people to resist that onslaught of manipulation.
I interviewed people who'd spent 15, 20 years, even 30 years, trying to get that feeling. And it wasn't something they necessarily felt when they first met Scientology or the Krishnas or the Rajneeshis or the Hindus or whatever. But somewhere early on, pretty early on, they had an experience and they were chasing it. It started making me sort of compare this to drug addiction, which is slightly invidious, perhaps. But
I wanted to hear what he was saying.
It was like exactly this thing of I've got to get my next fix. And I started thinking back over Scientology and going, there were people who
very strong initial conversion experiences that are induced by, in this case, I think mostly through this dynamic meditation, and confusion and change of identity and change of name and change of clothing and habits. It all gets to really be very, very strong manipulative. It's hard for people to resist that onslaught of manipulation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The way you laid it out, I think, really makes logical sense. Why do you think the leaders did this sort of thing?
Just before going to that, it creates,
Wheel and tire.
God says it elsewhere, it creates a feedback loop where somebody is wanting to get that euphoria they felt when they first did a technique. Now, the second time you do the technique, you won't ever get as much out of it. I interviewed people who'd spent 15, 20 years, even 30 years, trying to get that feeling. And it wasn't something they necessarily felt when they first met Scientology or the Krishnas or the Rajneeshis or the Hindus or what have you. But somewhere early on, pretty early on, they had an experience and they were chasing it. And it started making me sort of compare this to drug addiction, which is slightly invidious, perhaps. But it was like exactly this thing of I've got to get my next fix. And I started thinking back over Scientology and going, there were people who they'd go in, they'd be euphoric. The outcome of Scientology is very good indicators. You let out of your session to write your success story after you've had their
if they experience what they consider to be a miracle now, then
keep things on edge.
And then after that, there's all dissonance avoidance becomes a part of it. There's a lot of other kinds of manipulations, but if you overbreathe and scream, breathing or you might have a very if they experience what they consider to be a miracle now, then that would prove to them that the cult is correct. And then they don't know that if you overbreathe and scream, breathing or you might have a very, very strong experience that you can interpret.
Especially if somebody has sex with you immediately afterwards.
Yes. Not just someone, a group of people.
Oh, God. A savage group of people who might break your arms and legs if you're not careful.
Dissonance avoidance becomes a part of it. There's a lot of other kinds of manipulations, but I think that the strong, very strong initial conversion experiences that are induced by, in this case, I think mostly through this dynamic meditation, and confusion and change of identity and change of name and change of clothing and habits. It all gets to really be very, very manipulative. It's hard for people to resist that onslaught of manipulation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The way you laid it out, I think, really makes logical sense.
Who's this guy?
Why do you think the leaders did this sort of thing?
Just before going to that, he creates, as Yuval says, it I swear it creates a feedback.
There's this one guy.
Somebody is wanting to get
this British guy is a former Scientologist.
when they first did a technique. Now the second
who I
time
really
you do the
like,
technique, you won't
who I'm gonna have to read his book.
I interviewed
And it's
people
like
who've
the
spent
third
15, 20 years, 30 years, trying to get
the other guy
feeling. And it wasn't
He's
something
been
they
on.
necessarily felt when they first met Scientology or the Krishnas or the Rajneeshis or the Lunas or what have you. But somewhere early on, pretty early on, they had an experience.
some kind of professor and a therapist.
They were chasing it. And it started making me sort of compare this to drug addiction, which is
I just randomly
slightly invidious.
entered into it, and now I'm on like
it was like
6.
exactly this
But I
thing.
like
I've
this
got to get
British-
my next fix. And I started thinking back over Scientology and going, there were people who they'd go in, they'd be euphoric. The outcome of Scientology is very good indicators. You've let out of your session, which is like your success story, after you've had very good indicators. That means grinning to the rest of us. That means euphoria. So you've got somebody in that state and you've measured it on a little lie detector, and I did call it a lie detector, contrary to certain sociologists. It tells you that you're in this euphoric state. You go and do this thing. And then within 3 days, that's my usual experience of it, it'll collapse for most people. Some people can maintain this infatuation for months, but I didn't meet many of them in cults. They're the people you expect to meet, kind of glassy-eyed people. But people, they could do what they did, and they could get on with their lives, and they could incorporate this into their very being. And highly intelligent people, I knew 8 medical doctors in the UK who are in Scientology, the PhD cultists. People become invested in the pursuit of an experience. And perhaps the thing that's got me most about
my hat.
Talking with you about years, is the way that this feedback loop functions. We want to be infatuated. We love to be infatuated. And so we are looking for this thrill, this pleasure, this thing to have. And certain rituals comfort us, and we're able to induce a state by having the right kind of incense.
So let me describe the feedback loop. The feedback loop is when you have, for example, an awe experience of some kind, which either proves or reassures you that a certain something is correct, right? So let's say you have an experience that proves to you that Osho is God, right? The supreme God. And because of the experience proving the ideas, those ideas make you behave in a way that brings about more experience. So that is feedback loop. So you do have a dynamic situation in the morning that proves to you that it all works, and then because of that, you will do it the next day as well.
Yeah. And all based in a sense of certainty, assurance. That this is right. This is right.
Really real. It's not just certainty, it's special.
I tell the same story every time. I spent 2 hours when I was 17 being evangelized by a born-again Christian. And at the end, he walked away from me backwards and backed away from me. I wasn't being unpleasant to him. I was just saying, oh, but where does he say he's the Son of God? And unpleasant things like that, because he doesn't. And pointing at that. And he backs away from me and he looks at me, keeping me at a distance. He says, I don't understand the Bible, but I know that it's all true.
Yeah,
That is the kind of stuff. We all have that kind of certainty in our lives. This is not something that weirdos have. This is how we live. We believe in the things we believe in with passionate conviction, if we are to be human. So, but being willing to investigate our sense of certainty and say, do I really have any evidence that prunes will lead to me living an eternal life or what have you? What is the evidence for the health benefit of prunes? Or whatever the thing one is devoted to is. That seems to be suspended in the mix. The desire to get the buzz takes over from the, hey, this is ruining your life.
Yeah, and of course it comes with a lot of blind spots. So,
Which again, we all have.
we all have, but
You can't become enlightened and get rid of them, folks.
but in the case of infatuated romantic infatuation, or the fervor, which is sort of a different kind of infatuation, the blind spots can be very, very problematic and very dangerous. So people can stay in horrific situations that everybody around them sees that are really bad, and yet they do not.
Well, you can get a famous heart surgeon who starts murdering people because Sahara Vamshinrikyo tells him to. But the man who saved hundreds, maybe thousands of lives becomes a murderer.
Yeah,
using the
that's
tools
part of cult involvement. Now, there was the second question that Kirk asked about the leadership and why they did it. And I think that it's unclear where, how much blame should go to Sheila and how much to Osho. And it's unclear who's manipulating who. I think that in many times, as John correctly understood, there you have an empath psychopath dynamic where you get a weaponized empath, where the empath wants to, because they're such good-hearted, they want to do what the psychopath tells them and really do it well, even if it's horrific behavior. But in this case, it's not clear whether Sheila is that in that role or not. It seems like she is. Go ahead, John.
The reversal at the end, and I'm not going to spoil it for people, it's in the last episode, where you find out what Maranam Sheila does now and has been doing for some years.
Oh, I want to know.
And I think that totally transformed my view of her. I've read about her. There's a very good documentary called My Answer Is Now Complete about the big muddy ranch in Oregon. And
how about we do spoil it and give a spoiler warning?
Well, it's just to say that her behaviour now with the rest of them, I really liked Marsh Auntie B, Jane Stalker she is now. Perhaps because for some reason she really reminded me of my friend Hannah Whitfield. She's Australian, Hannah is from Africa, Zimbabwe. But that's very gentle and sweet. Something quite very charming about it. Her story, you're getting this story where she's saying, look, I tried to kill someone. I was the assassin. Because she could, when they taught them all how to use weapons, which is an aspect of all great religions, I think, that she was the best shot. So they just Sheila came up and said, right, you can kill people for us, obviously. and Hannah tried to kill the doctor, as I said before. Her journey, and she does have a book out, by the way, her story really touched me. That she was somebody who'd taken, she'd been pushed to do something that had completely freaked her out. In the end, she went back to the US and stood trial. She needed to see one of her own children who was terminal in another country, in Australia, I think. Again, that's a story that shouldn't be spoiled, what happened to her at trial. It's a beautiful thing. She realised it had been an enchantment. She realised it had been a spell. And I think perhaps they connect back to these traditional ways of looking at this. But say the magic
Sound is the worst sound.
The magic is suggestion.
It's the worst.
The magic is, it's not that, Satan does come down to earth and dance with you. It's that you've put yourself in such a stupefied state that you believe that that's what's happened. But the magic is out there. It's an enchantment. I spent 9 years in the group, and I was never a core member. I was particularly outside of it. And I had a perfectly good time. And I wasn't brainwashed. I wasn't subjected to a zombie-like state at any point. I wasn't abused or humiliated. So I'm quite unusual in my experience of so-called cult members. But the worst thing is that for 9 years, despite seeing from the start the organisation was misrun and silly in many aspects, Roger in sailor suits with jack boots on, come on. The amount of money they set about extracting from people, just unbelievable. What is right, really. But I continue to believe in it. And that, to this day, is the thing that fascinates me.
Did you have what you said that you had willful ignorance regarding some of the problems?
No, I was well aware of them. I talked about them. I read critical books. I complained about anything that bothered me. I never wrote nasty little chits on people, from people, just unlike state at any point who wasn't abused or humiliated. So I'm quite unusual in my experience of so-called cult members. But the worst thing is that for 9 years, despite seeing from the start the organisation was misrun and silly in many aspects, Roger in sailor suits with jack boots on, come on. The amount of money they set about extracting from people, just unbelievable events. But for 9 years, I believed in it. I didn't do anything that I might feel guilty or ashamed about because I was on the outside and just got lucky that way. Didn't harass anybody. I barely gave any of their so-called auditing because I wanted to learn how to do it, to understand it, not to make it my profession. And I went to art college and did that while I was doing it. So I was right, really. But I continued to believe in it. And that, to this day, is the thing that fascinates me.
Did you have what you said that you had willful ignorance regarding some of the problems?
No, I was well aware of them. I talked about them. I read critical books. I complained about anything that bothered me. I never wrote nasty little chits on people to attack them or any of that stuff. I believed in ethics. I believed in acting in a loving way towards all people, because I used to be a hippie, right? It's all right, I'm over it now, but I hate it. And I really, was part of it. What interests me is, I read 3 books that criticised them.
Which you're not supposed to do.
Talk to anybody about anything they wanted to know. And then, of course, did the secret levels after I'd been in for 7 years, and my faith began to wane. Oh no, I'm full of little devils. You weren't a good Scientologist then, though, because you're not supposed to do that. But how is it that? And I think for anybody, you construct reality, and all of our realities are a theatre, are constructed. Every one of us is, the other people in the world are characters within our minds. That doesn't mean they don't have independent motion, as the psychopath comes to believe. They're just, it's a solipsistic universe where we're just imagination. It doesn't mean that at all. It means that what we experience of the world is what we experience in the theatre of our minds. And that's a place that is not like the outside world, and it doesn't function necessarily along lines of reason and logic. We do function more along lines of desire and appetite.
Look what I found.
We like to think, not in a Freudian way,
really
we
love
want
that.
to kill it or make it.
But
the pleasure principle, we want to enjoy things.
So, John, if you had more of a experience, do you think that would have sustained you?
No, I did have basic things. I did have an experience frequently. Whenever I came out of an auditing session, I felt high. Whenever I went into an auditing session, I felt high when I was going into it. Which is why my auditing sessions were generally about 10 minutes long. And I had a very small amount of auditing compared to most people. I had less than Charles Manson, for example. in my 9 years, just to give you some map of how it transformed. But besides, Hubbard did say Scientology leads to success in any walk of life, and this certainly applied to Charles Manson, unfortunately. He said he just Carol went before now.
Is that what he said?
Well, what do you think the difference was?
So it's when you sit with your hands on the lie detector test, and the auditor asks you all kinds of questions you have to answer.
The pleasure principle. We want to enjoy things.
So, John, if you had had more of a awe experience, do you think that would have sustained you?
No, I did have, you see, the thing is, I did have an awe experience frequently. Whenever I came out of an auditing session, I felt high. Whenever I went into an auditing session, I felt high when I was going into it as well, which is why my auditing sessions were generally only about 10 minutes long. And I had a very small amount of auditing compared to most people. I had less than Charles Manson, for example, in my 9 years, just to give you some map of how it transformed. But besides, I did say Scientology leads to success in any walk of life, and this certainly applied to Charles Manson, unfortunately. Because he said he was a Carol went before me.
Well, what do you think the difference was between you and the people who sustained their belief in Scientology beyond those years?
Mainly look. Yeah, I thought you were going to say, what's the difference between you and Charles Manson for a minute? It's just one of those moments. It is. People transform at different rates. I left and came to go, I don't believe this anymore. I don't feel the need to destroy anybody else's belief. But
you also didn't join the Sea Org. You also didn't get abused partially because you were lucky.
No, well, I didn't get abused for a very simple reason, which is that Scientology has very strict policy about celebrities. And L. Ron Hubbard, bless his cotton socks, decided that anybody who was a writer, an artist, or a musician was a celebrity. And so even though, and I was all three of those things, I suppose I still am now, I can think about it, it doesn't go away yet. But they treated me as a celebrity. That I never heard what's called a severe reality adjustment until last year I was involved, and I hired a senior Scientology executive.
Which is, tell what that is. That is when someone screams at you.
I'm going to. A severe reality adjustment, an SRA. No, I've never even heard the term. One day this guy worked for me. He took my wife, who was selling paintings. He hadn't sold anything that week, so her stats were down. Took her into this tiny little room, probably stood about 3 inches away from her, and shouted at her. And I heard him shouting. He said, you're suppressive, you're trying to destroy John. And I just stood there. I didn't know what was going on, because I didn't know that this was a daily occurrence for Sea Organisation members. And indeed, when I finally got the courage up to sit this guy down and say, what on earth are you doing there? That doesn't work for me. I said, it's not written down anywhere. Where does this come from? Show me the policy that shows you're meant to do this. And he started crying. And his head in his hands, and he said, Hubbard did it to us on the ship. And he'd been a Hubbard assistant for years. He was somebody who'd been around and about Hubbard over several years in his company. He smuggled money for him. He'd done all sorts of things for him that people around him did. To maintain the most ethical being who ever lived. And he said he just did it all the time. And then, that was what I still remember. Then I had the chance to interview in detail over 100 conversations with over 1,000 Scientologists. And among them, there are many people who worked with Hubbard, and all of them report the tantrums. All of them report. He would just burn somebody to the ground. And I say 3 inches away, really 3 inches away from their faces, spitting into their faces. We should also say that his teeth were rotting in his head, so he smelled really bad. It's like being enveloped in a cloud of sulfurous gas. which may have been the effect he was seeking in life. But, and that, people who've seen that can then come away from that and go, in fact, one guy described one to me the first time he met Hubbard. Hubbard did this to him. You effing this, you guys didn't. About 7 swear words per, cuss words per sentence. And as the guy told me the story, I could see that he was going into a kind of bliss state. He's telling me how he first met Hubbard, and Hubbard called him a effing, blinding, this, that, and the other, at the top of his voice in front of a whole group of people. And he's just going, wow, he's wonderful. And he was still doing that 5 years later when I talked to him about it.
It sounds like a pimp and, sex worker relationship in some way.
Exactly. That is one end. Exactly.
Or an abusive relationship.
And any abusive relationship between people magnifies out into the group, where you have this learned helplessness, this kind of Stockholm syndrome. I didn't experience that, but the thing that freaks me out is I didn't know that anybody else was. Everybody I met in 9 years, without one exception, without a single exception, gave the impression they liked being in Scientology. Nobody. But then I started hearing about the rehabilitation protocols, and you got that there was this front of, like the Catholic Church covering up child sexual abuse because they were protecting the church,
And also, this is a group, that treats doubt as treason.
Yes.
So if you doubt, you are treasonous. Yeah. And I wouldn't I would assume that's how it is in Usher's group was as well. But I don't.
And indeed in Scientology, if you say anything negative about the group to another member, it is technically what's called a high crime, which is apparently the worst kind of crime you can commit in Scientology. So if you say, I think Ron Hubbard's fat, and that is a truth, by the way, he was fat, let's be honest about it. And he aged incredibly quickly, he just went seedy. But that was because he was working so hard on the technology that it was having devastating effects on his body.
Well, we got to adjourn. It's been fascinating. I have more questions about that. But yeah, so what would you two like to plug for people to go to if they want to learn more about the two of you?
I wouldn't go to Scientology scandal sheets about me. No, they're quite interesting too.
John wrote a number of books that I think should be.
Okay. Right. I'm so hot.
Should that I should plug because he will be able to plug himself.
I'm extremely humble, by the way.
And I will have a book. I will have a book out in the future, but some people might be hearing this in the future.
Oh no!
Might already be out.
We're traveling in time already. Isn't that good?
What? You have a working title, don't you, Yvonne?
Yeah. Currently, it might be the awe-inspired primate or something.
I tried for spiritual primate for a while. But
Maybe.
Yuval's expert on evolutionary theory. So he understands that the title is evolving still at the moment. But and there may be an exaptation at some point that works.
Yeah.
So.
What about you, John? What would your open minds?
I was just going to give you a list of all 15 books that because I'm too humble to do it. A big book about Scientology's the doors of his first foundation just before that moment. That's Selby's first guy. That's fairly good. Is it? What's it like, Yuval? Is it any good?
It's very good.
I see. It's very good. I gave him £5 before.
No, it's great, and I liked it a lot before I ever met you. When I met John, he induced awe in me because of how much I liked him.
I'm a celebrity.
He was a celebrity.
There's a short book this guy was really written to undo it for people who've been involved, but thankfully other people have liked it too. But there's a very short book called Scientology, The Cult of Greed, which is recent and basically is to explain it to somebody who's had no involvement just by throwing them into the amazing evidence that we made about such things as how great it is to do hard selling and how you should harass people and ruin them utterly if possible. Outside of that, I've written a couple of novels. We talked before about Seattle. I wrote a novel called Voodoo Child's Slight Return, which brings Jimi Hendrix back to life. Would that there was magic in the world to do that. And makes him a character in this hopefully amusing thriller.
Good night.